How is everyone doing tonight? You guys have almost made it through all the way of Module 8, Week 1. We've covered a lot of ground in database land, haven't we? Just think at the beginning of this week, most of you hadn't even written SQL. Now we've got our node database communicating in. Doing pretty well. Thanks for asking, Carolyn. I am ready for a long weekend, let me tell you. Reminder that class is canceled on Monday, so everyone can enjoy and have a long weekend. Hopefully take a breath of fresh air. Remember that taking breaks while programming is important.
Hey Max, I had a quick question.
Shoot.
I was remembering when we were doing things earlier in the program, sometimes with the data, like especially with the React project with Joey, the data that they called on was in JSON form, but SQL, does that store it in a JSON form? It's completely different, right?
Yeah, when it comes back into our JavaScript through the PG package, through that connection that we have, it is coming back as a JavaScript object, right? And so important to remember that JSON and a JavaScript object are not exactly the same, even though they look pretty much the same. A JSON object is just a string, right? It is just like it happens to follow this syntax with keys and values and arrays and numbers and all of that stuff. But at the end of the day, JSON is just a string. It is a JavaScript object when we can actually use like the dot notation or, access the array with indexes or whatever it is. However, SQL databases store data completely unrelated. And that is often why we have different data types. You'll see that the data types are similar to JSON, but not exactly the same. So SQL does not use JSON at all. It happens that when the data comes back as an object through our query, once we use the PG package, we are able to use that object and do things with it. However, SQL stores it completely separate. There are databases like like Mongo that don't quite store it like JSON, but they come pretty close to storing it like JSON. Because you could think, hey, JSON's great because you can nest data, right? So like if you wanted to store an array in your database, there's no clear way of doing that right now, right? We might have to make a separate table and do a join statement. And wouldn't it be great if our database could just take JSON and we could just shove JSON in there and pull JSON back out and it would just do all the right things? Well, yes and no. And so some crazy engineers had that idea and created NoSQL databases, literally the word no before SQL. And Mongo is the most popular version of that, where you can literally take JSON and just shove the JSON in. And Mongo's like, sure, no problem. I can do that. Great. So there are some databases that do use, I don't want to say that use JSON, but use a very similar formatting to JSON to track and keep track of all of that data. And we will be touching on Mongo. I still haven't quite figured out how to briefly touch on Mongo without going down the entire rabbit hole of Mongo. But we will be covering that because Mongo is becoming a more and more popular database. Just to kind of give you a taste of it without having to go too far down, getting distracted on Mongo. But very good question. And there's a list of great questions that Kyle sent me in Slack that I am going to get to at the end of class, unless, Kyle, there were any higher priority ones that you wanted to share earlier on. Okay. So hopefully I will get to those at the end of class. But we are kicked off. So let's go over what are all the things we did yesterday. And if you want to take notes, you may want to for the first exercise of class today. So what did we do yesterday? The whole point of this exercise is not to wait for my coffee to heat up, by the way. All right, I know it was a lot, but something had to sink in from yesterday. All right, we did CRUD in the database. Yeah, there we go. So we downloaded 2 apps. We downloaded Beekeeper Studio, and Beekeeper Studio is what allowed us to kind of connect into our Postgres database and start running queries and work on that outside of JavaScript land. And then we also downloaded the Postgres app. So one thing that's worth just touching on for a minute is Postgres is the server, right? Postgres is the database type. Postgres is what's managing the data and making it so we can run our SQL queries and all of that. What we downloaded yesterday was Postgres.app, and that is what allowed us to get our Postgres server running. Postgres.app is only a Mac tool that lets us spin up our database a lot quicker. It is entirely possible that we install Postgres through the command line using something like Brew or another tool and just install the server. But we installed Postgres.app, which handled a lot of that under the hood for us and allowed us to start our Postgres server using a UI, using a window or a tool, so we could just click one button and have it up and running. So important to differentiate. Postgres.app is just kind of a wrapper around Postgres itself, which is actually getting the server running. So when you go into the DevOps module and learn how to deploy a database, you will be installing Postgres itself, not Postgres.app, which installed Postgres for you. So yeah, Susan, we not only got our Postgres server running, but then we also set up a database in our Postgres server. And that's another important thing to recognize, is that we can have multiple databases running on one database server. So when someone says, did you connect to the database, they're really saying 2 things there, right? They're saying, well, did you connect to the server? And then once you got to the server, did you connect to the right database within that server, right? So we don't normally have like database folders or databases in databases, but it is entirely possible that one database server is running multiple databases inside that one server. So important to recognize that. And tonight we will actually be setting up a second database using the same database server. So we are going to go into Postgres, we're going to get that started up, and then we are going to go over to Beekeeper Studio and create a new database just to keep everything separate. What else? Let me just read through your comments here. Yeah, so we got the database connected to our backend code. So we were using Node and Express, and we were feeling pretty good about sending requests to the Express endpoints. And the endpoints were just using a local JavaScript object before this module and sending the messages back. This time we added a third layer of complexity of, oh, let's connect into the database. And then once we have established that we are actually connected into the database, let's start sending data back and forth, right? So not only were we pulling our messages from the messages table, we were also using an insert statement to insert those messages as well. Brielle, Postgres does work on Windows. Postgres, MySQL, Microsoft SQL, obviously, most of the SQL variants will run on Windows. But Windows is not known for being particularly friendly to set up a developer environment. So it is entirely possible that those tools run on Windows. The tool that we happen to use, Postgres.app, was Mac only. With that said, Postgres as the database will run on Windows. I just don't happen to know of the Postgres .app alternative to get it running on Windows. There is a tool called MAMP, M-A-M-P, that is helpful for getting MySQL running. That is kind of the equivalent of Postgres.app for MySQL. And you'll find that a lot of the features in Postgres, especially for a beginner, are duplicated over in MySQL that are in Postgres. In fact, about 2 weeks ago, I reached out to the instructors and I said, I don't really have a preference between Postgres and MySQL. I've used both. We switched over at work a year or two ago, and honestly, I haven't noticed any difference. And so I said, which one should I teach? And just like you guys, the vote was pretty much 50-50. Any of the instructors that chimed in were like, kind of like MySQL, but I don't really have a strong preference. Or yeah, I kind of like Postgres a little bit more, but it doesn't really matter to me. So now if I ask the question of should we cover SQL or Mongo, that would have been a much bigger discussion of like, whoa, those are huge technology differences. We want to make sure we're covering the right thing there. And so I go back and forth on MySQL and Postgres, really not huge differences between the two of them. And once we cover our object relational mapper next week, you'll see why it matters even less of which one we are using. With that said, there are definitely differences between the two, but it would take a more advanced user of someone who's working in the database a lot more to be able to pick apart the nuances and say, this is why one is better over the other. So we want to separate out our backend programming language from our database, because pretty much any backend programming language can connect to pretty much any database. So PHP is a programming language that is separate from Node.js. Off the top of my head, the most common backend programming languages you are going to see are Java, PHP, JavaScript with Node.js, Ruby, and probably Ruby on Rails, and .NET, and that is written in C#, I believe, most of the time. You may also see ASP.NET, which is a cousin to the .NET framework, a little older. But PHP is so popular because for two reasons. One, WordPress is built all in PHP. And so whenever you are modifying some WordPress behavior, that code that you're writing is going to be in PHP. The other kind of interesting thing with PHP is it was, I don't want to say the first, but probably the first language that got popular that allowed you to intermix your HTML and your PHP code kind of right in line. And that is what started to get the traction there. So all of those languages that I just listed and their accompanying frameworks, right? So it's important to separate out the frameworks that go with it as well. We are writing our backend code in Node.js, but we are using Express as our framework. We may be writing backend code in Ruby, but we're using Ruby on Rails, which is the accompanying framework for that. We may be using .NET, which is a framework, but we're going to be writing that code in C#. Right? So we want to identify the programming language before we talk about the framework. Now, with that said, the framework or the language may provide a different way to connect to the database. So it is entirely possible, and this is when we talk about our stack matching, right? We are teaching React, Node, and Express as the framework, and then our database, which we're happening to use Postgres. But there is nothing saying I can't use React with my Node and Express and MySQL, or with Mongo. Or I could change it up and choose to use Postgres with Ruby on Rails and use Angular as my front end, right? So all of these pieces, as we move and jump to different parts of the stack, they are all mix and match. So we happen to be teaching this one particular stack, but when you go to apply for a job, you may find that they are using React on the front end and Postgres as the database, but an entirely different database. I'm sorry, an entirely different backend. Their API server may be written in an entirely different language, and because it's in a different language, it normally is in a different framework as well. The framework is kind of always tied to the language. So you wouldn't take Ruby on Rails and use Ruby on Rails framework in JavaScript, right? The framework is often tied to the language. So there are all different kinds of stacks. And again, just to reiterate, because it's easy to lock up on an interview when they're like, oh, what stack do you use? You go, I don't know, JavaScript, right? And it's like, we are using a particularly heavy JavaScript stack, but the things we have covered is React, Node, JS, and Express on the back end, and then Postgres as our database server. So hopefully that clears some things out, some things up. It is, Ariel, all the way back to your question, it is up to HostGator to choose who they are going to support. Because a lot of web hosts look for free, so they don't have to pass additional costs on to their customers. PHP and MySQL for probably 10 or 15 years were the dominant players. If you wanted to run something on cheaper hosting where you weren't setting up your own servers, PHP and MySQL were pretty much your only options. That is who your host provided. And unless you were going to go set up your own servers and maintain them on your own and start from scratch, that is who you got access to. Over the past couple of years, we have started to see hosts opening up and going, all right, PHP is not the only name in town anymore. Maybe we should support Node.js, where a host like Namecheap, you can actually run your Node.js code right on your $5 a month hosting or somewhere in that price point. And same for the database. It used to be only MySQL. Postgres is now becoming a popular alternative that you can set up your databases through your hosting over there. That is crossing the line a little bit when we get into hosting of talking about DevOps, right? The DevOps is the whole notion of, all right, I'm a developer. Now I would like to operationally make this work, right? I would like to get this working in operations. And so that is when we cross the line into, hey, we're not just writing code anymore. We probably need to be thinking about where this code is going to run after my computer. It's going to run on a server. It's going to run up in the cloud. It's going to need to connect to a database, and that database is going to need to talk to my back end. And oh, I need to put my front end code somewhere as well and be able to access that. So that is all kind of crossing the line into DevOps. And that is when I run streaming. I mean, pass it off to our next instructor, and Nathan is going to be covering a lot of that stuff as well. So a lot of overlap, and DevOps is, I don't want to say a new field, but it used to be, we had our server admins, and our server admins would just take the code and grumble and figure out how to get it working. And DevOps is a new-ish title in the field. Just like full stack really became a title maybe 15, 20 years ago of this whole notion of oh, it's not just desktop applications running anymore. We should separate out our front end, our back end, and our database. And that all together is what we consider a stack for web application. So yeah, sorry, I went on a tear there. But the reason why a lot of those shared hosting sites use PHP and MySQL is because they are free. However, fortunately, the newer hosts, or the more popular hosts, or the more progressive hosts are starting to support additional languages as well, like Node.js, and additional databases like Postgres as well. With that said, like I said, I was super indecisive of which one I was going to cover, MySQL or Postgres. So not a huge decision there. And once we get into our ORM, our object relational mapper next week, you're going to see that we can actually just literally change one line and get it connected to MySQL instead, and all of our code is still going to work. So let me try and catch up. Caitlin makes a good point. .NET, because .NET is made and supported by Microsoft, .NET is probably the only framework that you will find that it works 10 times better on Windows than it does on Mac. But because the Mac is built on Linux, which is an open source operating system, it isn't Linux. It was built on top of Linux. Because that is all part of the open source community, it turns out that making development tools are much easier to do on the Mac than it is on Windows. So you will find a lot of developers gravitating towards the Mac. With that said, in the past 5-ish years or so, Microsoft has really tried to correct course and try to make Windows a more friendly environment for developers. And the major thing that they announced support for was that you could actually use the Linux shell in Windows. And when we say the shell, we mean basically where you're executing your terminal commands. So for the longest time, Windows was known for having different command line terms or different command line commands, essentially, different from Mac. And because Mac and Linux were the same, if you run ls on a Mac, you always get the same output. And if you go over to a server, because most web servers run on Linux and run ls, that exact same command will run on your web server and you'll be able to see all the commands. But as soon as you go over to Windows and you run ls, Windows is like, what the hell is ls? I've never heard of that command before. I have a totally different command for listing out all of my files. So about 5-ish years ago, Windows announced that they were going to support the Linux shell, Linux command line, essentially. And that really opened up a lot of people and has attracted more developers to the Windows platform. Syracuse in particular is known for being a huge .NET employer. There are a lot of companies. Caitlin mentioned Raymore and Flanagan, where she works. They are a .NET company, and whenever you see a .NET company, you can pretty much assume that they are going to be a Windows-based company as well. Sidearm Sports, I know, uses .NET. TCG Player, as of at least a year or two ago, was primarily .NET. I believe they were starting to explore moving over to Node.js. I can't speak with any certainty if they actually pulled that trigger. There are at least 2 other major employers in Syracuse that use .NET that are not coming off the top of my head. However, .NET, while it is still actively supported by Microsoft, in the rest of the development world, it is not looked upon fondly because Microsoft is so closed off, or was for so long. .NET is not a particularly popular tool to reach for if you were to make a project from scratch or start fresh. Carolyn, good question. Oracle is not a popular tool anymore. They still have a very popular SQL server because it scales particularly well over at Oracle. Oracle also, interestingly enough, owns MySQL, but have chosen to keep MySQL open sourced and licensed for free. However, when you get into scaling a database, when you're talking about a bank that has 100 or 10 million customers and you need to keep track of all of their transactions, we get out of the realm of, oh, I've got that database server running on my computer pretty quickly. So those paid versions of SQL are known for scaling particularly well. With that said, MySQL and Postgres are used at companies like Google as well. So not for all of their products, but there are companies that use the open sourced versions as well. So I'm not quite sure. Oracle does own Java, and there was a big trademark battle over that, or an intellectual property battle over that, because Google also uses Java as their primary programming language for the Android operating system. A decision that they have come out and said that they regret, but it's very hard to move an entire operating system and all of the apps built for that operating system to a different programming language. So Java and the Oracle SQL Server are a popular stack, and you can make backend apps using Java, but it really depends on the company, and you can totally mix and match and say, I'm going to use PHP and Oracle Server. And as long as you're paying for a license for that server, that is totally something that you can do. SSMS is a tool Caitlin mentioned that they use. It is probably a lot more powerful than Beekeeper Studio. I wanted to find a free tool that could kind of get us up and running quickly. However, there are some great tools. Data Grip is another one that is made by JetBrains. JetBrains also makes WebStorm, which is the text editor that I use at work. You guys are reaching the point in the program where you can start to explore alternative tools. So VS Code is a great option. I know some devs, professional senior web devs that use VS Code and love it, and they've got it configured exactly the way they want it. I pay $130 a year for WebStorm, and while that seems like a lot, when you realize that I spend more time in WebStorm than I do in my own bed, all of a sudden $130 a year is a drop in the bucket. So WebStorm is an alternative text editor to VS Code. It crosses the line into what we consider an IDE, which stands for an integrated development environment. And WebStorm has a lot of tools that you can get working in VS Code, but in WebStorm, they just work out of the box and it's just a magical experience. So just throwing alternative tools out there. If you have been in VS Code and you start wondering if there is something better out there, the question is not, is it better? Is it better for you? Because you do reach a point with tools where, it doesn't matter how fancy your hammer is. If you don't know how to use a hammer, it's not going to do you any good. So the same goes for a text editor. There are certain things that work where we say, well, this is what we use. Tough shit, you got to use it. Our database, and we use Postgres, and it's like, I don't care that you happen to like MySQL more. It would take us weeks and weeks to switch over to a different database server. So unless you can tell me that couple week investment is worth it, we're sticking with our database. And there have been times that an employee has made that case and we have actually switched over to a different tool. For text editors, some employers will say, you've got to use this. I don't care. At our company, I say, this is what we recommend, and we will pay for WebStorm for you. But if you go hardcore and you go, I would like to edit all of my files in the terminal, I'm not going to stop you. Like, if that is a decision you have made, that is a decision that is up to you. So really depends on your employer, whether they are going to set a standard for you, whether they are going to pay for licenses for you, all of that kind of stuff. Sorry, catching up in the chat. Kyle, thank you for throwing out. Yes, yesterday we did cover debugging, right? Because we now have 3 different places that our code can go wrong. Our code can go wrong on the front end, which we saw with the ID, right? We weren't sending that ID back through the front end to get our edit working. It can go wrong in the back end itself, and the back end is kind of that middleman, right? The back end is keeping track of whatever the front end is sending. It may be doing some validation, like making sure the timestamp is correct and getting generated on the server and then saving it to the database. But it is also responsible for getting that data from the database, making sure it is structured properly, which we saw with the whole content versus text, structuring it that way and sending it back to the front end. Ariel, you mentioned cPanel. cPanel is a user interface, a UI tool that almost every web host I have ever used gives you control over your server without having to run the server commands. It turns out when you give a user interface, it is much safer and much easier for them not to screw something up when you put them in the terminal, because 9 users out of 10 probably don't even know how to run a terminal command. So cPanel, very popular tool provided by web hosts. They pay a lot of money for that licensing, but it saves them from a lot of headache. So it may not be called cPanel in every web host, but it is very rare. Doesn't matter if you go from Namecheap to HostGator to Bluehost to GreenGeeks to, I can't even think of the other non-commercial level hosts. They almost always use cPanel, even if they have it branded to not say cPanel in the name. So yeah, don't have a huge preference on hosts. I have used Green Geeks in the past. One of our previous instructors has used HostGator and was very happy with them. I really like Namecheap. But once you cross into the DevOps module, you're going to start learning how to not think about things as hosting and think about things as servers up in the cloud. And how can you configure that server from scratch in Amazon Web Services or Google Cloud Platform or IBM Bluemix or Microsoft Azure, and be able to set that all up from scratch. Latonia, you have a question on when do we change code in the front end and when do we not? Good question. You want to be careful because when you're making an API server, it is possible that you are the only one using that API server, right? It is possible, okay, I've got my API server, I'm making changes in here because I'm the only one working on the front end. However, I think the majority of the time, and I need to be careful when I'm making a sweeping statement like that, but I think it's safe to say most of the time when you're building an API, you're not going to be the only one using the API. So a good example of this would be like the New York Times API. Could you imagine if they made a change and said, oh, we don't want to call this thing title anymore. We want to call this book title to be more specific. Well, now every person who uses their backend API and is looking for title isn't going to find it. And everyone's website is suddenly going to say no, 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 whenever they try and go get a title. And so in that case, the New York Times would probably say, oh, we're going to leave that thing on our back end called title, and we'll go to our front end and update our front end to change it around over there. So it is often common to version your API and say, all right, this is version 1 of our API. And once we release version 1 of our API, we are never going to change it. And whenever we are going to change it and add in new endpoints or change the way the data is going to be changed or sent back or formatted or whatever it's going to be, we're going to create version 2 of our API. And in the documentation, you may find that people have different versions of their API. You usually want to use the latest one. There are a couple times that they will release an API and say, like, we just don't have those features available yet. So use the older API endpoints because we've got those features covered, and then use the newer ones, you know, if you have what you need in there. But 9 times out of 10, because your API is used by users writing code that you don't control, you would want to change your code on the front end instead of changing it on the back end. However, because we're still learning all of these fundamentals, it is common for us to kind of go back and forth. Last night, not the end of the world where we were changing that lining up. We could have gone to the database and renamed the column and then updated all of our select statements. We ended up going to the back end and changing it so whatever was in content got dumped into text. Or we could have gone to the front end and said, hey, don't look in text anymore, look in this thing called content. So really, right now, because we control every step of it, it doesn't really matter where we change it. But in terms of where you make changes, you probably make the least number of changes in your database, the second least amount of changes in your backend, and then the most amount of changes in the front end. But there are headaches that pop up of what happens when I need to change both my backend and my front end and make sure my front end is knowing where the updates are and my backend is also knowing where those updates are. And that's when you'll see something that comes up that says scheduled maintenance. Our service will not be available between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m. on, Friday, whatever it is. And those are the people in DevOps who are taking all of their developers' code, pulling the plug, not letting anyone in, making all the changes they need, and then pushing that plug back in with the updated code to make sure their front end is matching their back end, which is matching the database, and all of that is talking together. So going too far down that rabbit hole is unfortunately too much to cover in a boot camp, but definitely a concern of DevOps. I know you guys had a couple wicked storms rolling through. We are getting torrential downpours. So if you see all of a sudden my video feed goes dark, it is because my light is not on my battery backup, but my monitors and internet connection is. So hopefully we do not lose power, but if we do, I will scramble and figure out what I can do. Okay. Yes, Carolyn, I agree. Smart move on Microsoft's part. Microsoft just released Windows 11 in the past week, maybe last week. And their big push is to open up the walls and say, whoever would like to build on Microsoft can. We're happy to support Apple products. If Apple would like to get iMessage working, we are not going to stand in their way. Apple traditionally is known for their walled garden approach, meaning that if you are inside their ecosystem, everything just works incredibly well. And as soon as you get outside of their ecosystem, Apple says, no, you can't access that, stop it, buy one of our very expensive products, and everything will just magically start working for you. So no denying that Apple products are more expensive. And that is not just because their hardware tends to be slightly higher quality than most consumer grade stuff. It is also because you are paying for the premium of being inside their garden, having iCloud work, having things just sync across their devices, all of that stuff. Probably about 15 years ago, I drank the Apple Kool-Aid and have not stopped sipping the Apple Kool-Aid since. I pay a lot of money for their devices. I spend a third of my life on their devices. And so for me, that premium is worth it. With that said, Microsoft has been doing some great things for the developer community. They own GitHub, they own VS Code. They have started doing great things with Linux. They are trying to move in the right directions with developers. But I think that's the end of the rant for Microsoft. Caitlin makes a good point. Visual Studio and Visual Studio Code are not quite the same things. Visual Studio Code is an open source program that is built in JavaScript. It runs great on the Mac. It runs great on Windows. It is probably the most popular tool for text editing, at least a free one for people to get started at. It was built by Microsoft and is a totally different program than Visual Studio, which is, I believe, Windows only. They may have changed that in the past year or two, but Visual Studio is a IDE, is an integrated development environment. It is primarily used for .NET development, although it does support other languages, but Visual Studio only runs on Windows. Carolyn, an update and a new version, kind of the same thing. An update is more of a verb, right? That is the process of installing a new version or upgrading to a new version or whatever the process is to get that new version in. We tend to use something called semantic versioning, which is a major, minor, and a patch. So whenever you see like 3.2.10, right, what we do is we keep incrementing the last number whenever we have a patch coming out. Whenever we go, oh, sorry, we pushed something out, it was broken, let me just bump that last version number up. And there won't be any new features. There won't be really any changes. Just something we told you was going to work should now be working better now. We do a minor version whenever we have some smaller features coming out, some tweaks, but it doesn't feel like a whole new thing, right? So, oh, we added a spell check in, or, we added a new page that lets you export your content, or, a couple little features. We do a major version release whenever we're like, hey, we're holding this whole event and telling people all about these new features, and we're releasing 300 new features, and oh, this is the big deal. iOS is probably the most known thing to do semantic versioning, although Windows does it as well. So, okay, we have iOS 15 coming out next year, and that's going to allow us to do FaceTime calls to people who don't have Apple products. And we're going to add in all kinds of new messaging and I don't know, I'm blanking off the top of my head what iOS 15 is doing, but all these big new features. But then we'll have several releases that come out over the past year. So I think we're on iOS 14.3 or .4 maybe. And there were a couple new features that came out, but not anything that Apple was like, you know, alert the presses on. And then we do patches whenever Apple goes, oh crap, there's a security vulnerability. Let's get that out really quickly. So when you are creating your own code, semantic versioning isn't used as much on backend code or database code, but it is definitely used in the front end. So at work, we're on version 3.1. I think 180, because yes, we have that many patches where we're sending out these quick little new features anywhere between one line of code of, oh, sorry, I broke that, which I literally got a request at like 5:21 tonight where I was like, oh, I can't fix that quick enough. But we are currently planning version 4 of our software. And that is, I spent all day today planning that. I will probably spend all day tomorrow planning that. I spent all of that time in our project management tool loading up. I'm approaching over 1,000 different things that our software needs to do, that we are migrating from version 3 over to version 4, starting with a blank slate, and taking we just hired a user experience role for a full-time job where they are coming in and just designing mock-ups and wireframes and figuring out how our software should work, not how our software does work. So we are going through that as the main push for this new version of our software is, hey, we've created this internal tool. And I know Caitlin deals with this a lot at Raymore of, we've got this internal tool and it kind of works all right, but because it's just internal, we never really worried about it. But now we want to polish up that tool. We may be opening it up for some of our customers to use. We need to go back and we need to make sure, one, we move all of these features over, but two, it makes sense in a way where a user isn't being like, what do I click on next? And so that is what is coming up for me at work between now and November. So if you see me losing even more hair, it is not my receding hairline. It is all of the planning going into that project.
Yeah. So
and my receding hairline.
I'm sorry. So releases are sort of like teasers too. You know, like in the evening news, they tell you coming up in the news and it ends up being the last story. You know, it's also kind of a way to keep your audience interested and buying the product. And
yes, a lot of applications will do release notes, which are tied to a specific version that they are releasing of, hey, here are the things that we have fixed. If you go to the App Store, either on Android or on your iPhone, and read Slack's release notes, they have probably one of the most entertaining ones where they've got a good sense of humor when they say, like, we found a bug that we fixed. They always have an interesting way to turn that as well. So a lot of companies have interesting release notes. Yeah, so Caitlin brings up two interesting points. There are times that someone will build a tool and leave the company, or they will build a tool and forget about the tool. And then you have to go back and maintain that as a new developer coming in. Probably the hardest part of onboarding is just figuring out where all the code is and trying to get the code running on your computer. And there are times that companies will make a language jump and say, oh, we're not going to support Java or ASP.NET anymore, but they have an entire staff of all those developers, right? And so they're all learning the new tools, and anything they build new is going to be in that language, but they still have a lot of those legacy tools. So you can come in as a developer and someone will go, hey, this is broken. And you go, this hasn't been touched in 4 years and is written in an entirely different language, and now I need to maintain that. So all kinds of interesting things that can happen with different programming languages and releases and all of that stuff.
Sorry, I just keep snowballing in chat.
Yeah, technology is always moving forward. That does not mean your code is always moving forward, right? You need to pull your code with you. And eventually it gets to the point where you may say, we can't support that anymore. We have to rebuild this tool in a newer language, or we need to do better documentation, or, you know, oh, this tool was initially built for people using it on the internet, and now every one of the people using this is trying to load it on their phone. And the front end needs to be updated. We're seeing a massive shift right now from a lot of front ends not being built in React or Angular, and companies trying to hire people left and right, React or Angular developers, to update their entire front end, make it more modern, make it integrate with APIs a little bit better. That is a huge lift right now. Geez, after that, I'm ready for a break already. Anyone have any other questions? Okay, so tonight we are going to push off the ORM until next week. That is what I am most excited about getting into. Next week, we have 2 major topics we need to cover. We've got our object relational mapper of, hey, this SQL stuff is cool, but wouldn't it be cool if we could do all of this in JavaScript? Maybe I'm the only one who thinks that, but I think you guys will have a light bulb moment when we do get to that step. It is a weird moment because you go, but I like SQL, but I also like my JavaScript. And so we will integrate an object relational mapper next week. And then we also need to touch a little bit on database design, right? Of like, hey, we've got our messages table, but like those joins were pretty cool. We should start talking about when we need to put things in different tables. How do we know not to store the user information in the messages table? How do we diagram all of that out so someone else could figure that out for me, hand it over to me, and I could code out those tables and make all of those tables work? Or those tables may already be created and I need to know what is in those tables and how to pull the data across them in my own code because the database may already be built for me. But yes, Carolyn, those are ERD, entity relationship diagrams. And we will be covering those next week with our object relational mapper. Brielle, that is a great question. The answer tends to be you can, but it is a very, very bad idea to store images directly in your database. Databases tend to be good at storing smaller bits of data. So using our IDs or using our small strings, or yes, we can store a couple paragraphs, but we don't want to store a ton of that, right? And so when we're talking about our rows, every row may be a kilobyte of data or even less. And the databases are very much optimized to store small little bits of that data. What we do instead is we tend to store our files at a file system that tends to be better at storing images. So in a content delivery network, or we upload our images via FTP to our web host, or we save the file on our hosting server, or basically what we want to do is we want to store the file somewhere else, know where we are storing it, and then store that path in the database. So instead of storing the file right in our database, we are going to store, hey, that file's in /users/my username/pictures/123.png. And then what we can do is we can pass that information back through our back end all the way to our front end. And our front end, knowing the path, will now know where to go get that image on our web server. Creating a back-end service that can handle image uploads and store file paths in the database, and then also be able to provide access to the files themselves, is a task that I would probably consider senior level. Caitlin, feel free to chime in with your experience there. It's a very common thing to do. I don't want to say that that's, but it is a tricky task to do right. And so probably something we won't cover, but it is entirely possible to go into a poorly structured database and find that someone has what we call encoded the file. taken basically everything behind what is in the actual .png or .jpeg or whatever and shoved it right in the database. And that tends to blow up spectacularly, especially when you're storing larger image files, because now the database, when you go, oh, I would like this one image, please, it is trying to read through all of the images you have stored in the database to pull that one back out. So too long didn't read summarize of all of that is no, we shouldn't be storing images in the database, although it is possible to do it. And certain databases like NoSQL databases may actually store that image better because they are set up for unstructured data. But SQL is really, it's really anal about storing structured data. And when we try to store something unstructured in it, like an entire image file, it gets cranky with us fast. Yeah, I'm glad Khan Academy touched on that a little bit. Definitely not recommended to store images in there. Unfortunately, more of an advanced topic to talk about how we store it correctly, but to over summarize, we store the image somewhere else and then store the path in the database of where we can go find that image when we need it. Yeah, there are all kinds of tools of where you can store your images. There are content delivery networks that will actually store copies of your images all over the US or the globe, so that when we go to retrieve those images, we get it from the closest place to us, which tends to be also be the fastest place that we can go get those images. Certain CDNs have layered in additional features like cropping, zooming, being able to pull back different resolutions. So, you know, on my phone, I may need a smaller version of the image, but if I'm on my 4K monitor, I may want to pull back a larger version of that image. CDNs will be able to help a lot with that. And most CDNs most clouds tend to have their own versions of the CDN. So wherever you are deploying your code and on DevOps land, they tend to have their own version of that as well. Arial really ranges in pricing depending on how they charge. Some charge per image, some charge for bandwidth, right? If I want to store one image, but I have 100,000 users loading it, that's still going to cost more for the CDN than if I have 10 images that, you know, 10 different users are loading. So really hard to estimate. And that is a common complaint with cloud pricing, not just for the CDN, but everywhere, where they like charge per minute or they charge per gigabyte. And it's like, just tell me how much this is going to cost. And they're like, depends, how much are you going to use it? And they have these calculators that you can go in and enter that information. But like the first month you get your server bill, you're like, this could be $2, $20, $200, or if I've screwed something up, $20,000, and I really don't want to know which one it's going to be. So with the cloud, you really have to be careful because they don't care if you are a startup who has 2 employees, or if you are Microsoft who has 200,000 employees. The cloud will allow you to charge as much to your credit card as you would like. And you tend to not get that bill until the month after you have used all of those services. And yes, Ariel, a common complaint is getting AWS or any of the clouds to stop charging you. It's much harder to delete things on the cloud than it is to set things up on the cloud. Again, that might be an overgeneralization, but a common complaint. I believe there were still students in cohort 1 that may be paying AWS bills from servers they set up.
I took down my entire capstone because it kept charging me.
Normally those clouds follow the razor company model where, you know, oh, you can get this razor for only a couple bucks, or the ink tank model. The printer's only $100, but the ink tanks are like $50 each. A lot of the clouds will have free tiers for like 6 months or a year. And as long as you aren't going over their limits, you are not charged for it, which is why you could get through the entire Careers in Code program and not get a bill, and then forget that your code is running. But don't forget, it is actually running somewhere. So Amazon will start to charge you after it for after 6 months or a year or whatever it is. So I will actually write a note to Nathan to remind everyone to show you when you create something, also how you delete that thing as well. AWS stands for Amazon Web Services. I am a big proponent of knowing what acronyms stand for because they are something that always come up in job interviews. And it's always dangerous using acronyms that you don't know. Amazon Web Services started, by the way, they were probably one of the first big clouds that opened it up to the public. And Amazon realized that they had invested so much in their server infrastructure that they could allow other companies to piggyback on their server infrastructure and they could make a killing off of it. So it was actually one of the first sectors of Amazon that turned a profit because Amazon has been investing so much into their delivery and logistics network that even though people spend billions of dollars on Amazon, it isn't making money yet because they keep on building out and putting in more warehouses and investing in more shipping and all of that. But Amazon Web Services, I don't know if it was Jeff Bezos or someone very smart at Amazon said, well, we've invested in this whole cloud thing. We should charge other companies to be able to build on top of the infrastructure we already have. And so they did, and AWS was a huge hit. And Google had their eye on them for a while and said, oh, we'll catch up to them later, where Google, we already have a ton of infrastructure. When that becomes a serious offering, we will jump in that competitive space. And Google tried doing it and realized that they couldn't do that in 3 months. It was going to take them 3 years. And that is why Google Cloud is behind Amazon Web Services, although offer a ton of similar products today. We use Google Cloud at work. I do not have a preference between AWS, Google Cloud, and Azure. I just happen to know Google Cloud, but a lot of the product names don't match up. But you know, they all do similar things. So if you tell me, oh, I use this Amazon product called blah, 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 you know, I'm like, all right, well, what does it do? Oh, that is called this over at Google. So it's just a matching game most of the time. All right. That was a good random question session. Does anyone have any other random questions? I feel like every part of my brain has been drawn from here. Okie doke. All right, so what we are going to jump into, 1 second. Okay. So tonight, we are not going to cover any new concepts. We are going to go over what we did tonight. I'm sorry, what we went over last night. I'm sorry, I got like 14 messages at once, and I was like, oh, I want to make sure I'm not missing any of your messages. Okay, so before we dive into what we are going to do, I am going to start a blank Google Doc, and we are actually going to do a quick tangent because we haven't gone enough of those tonight for documentation. So I sent a message in the chat last night of the videos are a great resource, and totally encourage you guys to keep using those. But when you get outside of this program, you're going to have documentation, and that is pretty much going to be the only thing you can rely on other than maybe coworkers, right? So while being able to follow through step by step is important of what we covered last night, it's more important to understand why we are doing it. But before we can get to the why are we doing that step, it's important to say what that step is. So if you can think all the way back to last night, what was the first thing that we did outside of Khan Academy? What was the first thing we did after Khan Academy?
We grabbed our old code and put it in a new folder.
We did. And what did we do
Back and then
after
front.
that?
Started open them both and got the React server running.
Yep. And
on
so
the
we're going
front.
to start from a new project tonight, and we're only going to be focusing on the back end and the database, right? So we're not going to worry about a front end. We're going to use Postman because that's a tool we've already used. But I realized that starting you guys at throwing the back end and the database and the front end may have been a little much, right? Like now we have to get 3 pieces of the puzzle working together when we had just the back end and, you know, we're trying to get the database attached to it. So tonight we are going to make a back end for a to-do list app and store that all in a database, but we're going to send all of our requests right through Postman. So not discounting anything that you just said, Susan, but what did we do after that? We set up the database, exactly. So we did a couple things, right? Because we want to break this down into the smallest possible steps. Because set up the database, well, we did Postgres and we did Beekeeper Studio and we ran some SQL commands and then we closed out of them and then we reopened them and then we was like, whoa, 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 whoa. That's a lot of stuff there. Let's just slow roll that a little bit. The first thing we had to do is we have to get our database server running. And let me blow that up so you guys can see this. But before I go into all of this, I did something bad. I should name whatever this documentation is called, right? Because we don't want to just throw these steps out there. We want to leave these steps documented. So if we come back to this in 6 months after not touching a database in that time, we're going to want to be able to call them up, right? So we are going to say project setup for Express backend with Postgres database. It's a long title, but Google doesn't care. And when I'm in my Google Drive and I'm searching for this, which by the way, I will share this with you guys, but I want to be able to type in Postgres Express setup and have something come up, right? And that search is going to pop up because yes, we could file this and we could be meticulous with our folders, but to be honest, we've got 10 employees and I can't find anyone's files in their folders because everyone uses a different folder structure. So I've just learned to rely on search, and hey, it turns out surprisingly that company called Google is really good at searching things. And so I rely on file titles more than I do of, oh, let me stick this in the right folder. With that said, I rely on folders a lot in my code, right? And you'll see that whenever I'm in the classroom repo, I'm creating not just in the module, I'm going into the week, I'm going down to the day, and then I'm naming the project folder before I even create my files in that. So folders still a lot more important to code than it is to just documentation. But we want to name things to be descriptive. Okay, so we got our database server running. Does anyone remember what we did after that? I'm skipping over like Postgres installation and our Beekeeper Studio installation. And the reason I'm doing that is because now that we have those tools set up, we don't need to reinstall them or download them or do any of that stuff. So yeah, we have to test that it's running.
It was just, yeah.
And so Ariel, skipping ahead just a little bit there, but we will get to that. So I want to focus on the database steps and then the backend steps and then getting those two talking together. So we got our database server running. Then we connected to the default database, which happens to be our username in Beekeeper Studio. Okay, so now we're in Beekeeper Studio. We got that connect working. We're in the default database. What did we do next? we didn't quite DB connect to the server, create table, we're on the right track. We're still in the default database. We're still in our usernames database. We're starting a whole new project here. So what we want to do is have a separate database. We called it messages 1 last night, but we need to create that database first. So we are going to create a new database with unique name matching project name. Yes, that's verbose. But if I just said create database in my documentation, you'd be like, create what database? I'm already in a database, right? So we want to be verbose in our documentation, not overly verbose, which is totally possible to do. But you know, what do we want to create our database? So we want to say we want to create a new database with whatever the project name we're working on is. So we're going to be doing a to-do project tonight. So I'm going to create my project called to-do. Okay. What did we do after we created our database? We switched to it and tested it. Yeah, exactly. So we switch Beekeeper Studio to our newly created database. And then we did run a select query just to make sure that we were in our database and that was working. But Carolyn, you were on the right track. Then we created first table. Okay, that was it. Now we're done in Beekeeper Studio. So instead of just rambling on my list here, I'm going to break my documentation up into sections in case I could use parts of this documentation later. So I'm going to skip down. I'm going to say up here, what are all of these steps? I would call all of these steps database setup. Okay, we got our database set up. What is the next category of steps? We got to do our backend setup. You got it, Latonia. Okay, so our backend setup, we need to, where do we start with our backend? Before we even get to NPM, there's a step we need to do before that. Can't even connect to our database yet. We don't have a file. We don't even have a file because we don't have a. We're not going to copy the files over because we're talking about starting a project from scratch here. So what we are going to do is create our folder. You got it, Kyle. Okay, so create folder for backend code. And then, Carolyn, you are completely right. That's an empty folder, right? So we probably want to open VS Code and matching terminal in the right folder, of course. And then we want to npm init. And I'm going to do my -y here. The -y is optional, but it is basically not going to ask us a bunch of questions of what we want in our package.json. It's going to fly through and take all the defaults. Okay, now we've npm initted. What are we using? What do we have to install? Because we are creating a backend. Don't need to install NodeMon because we're using npx for that. NodeMon is more of a development tool than something that we have to install project level. Although we could, it wouldn't hurt to install it project level. There is something called dev dependencies in NPM land where you can actually install things that you only use during development. But when you go to deploy your code out, it's not a dependency of the production code. And in order to do that, instead of our --save, we do a --save-dev, and that keeps it in a separate group, but don't want to go too far into it. Yeah, if you go to run the command and it doesn't find it installed on your computer, it will say like, hey, heads up, it's going to take me a minute because I want to go get the latest version and have a copy to run it on your computer. So when it installs it, I know it actually says you want to install it, but it's probably not the most accurate verbiage, because it's like, do you want me to install a temporary copy of it so you can use it? And that's kind of the magic of NPM, is that you can use, NPX, is that you can run commands that you don't want to worry about maintaining an installation and copy on your computer and all of that stuff. So what we are going to install is Express, and we are also going to install body parser while we're here. We can, while we're in here, we can get our PG command, right? And we might need cores. Top of my head, that's probably everything, but the beauty of documentation is that it can be living documentation. So we can always go back and add to this. Okay, so we've got our NPM all set up. We would like to put code in something. What do we need to do to put code in something? We need to create our file. So we're going to create file called server.js or app.js or index.js or my server is freaking awesome.js, whatever you would like. Okay, now we're switching over to our code, right? And so what we want to do, I'm going to break this out into another section, and I'm going to call this code time. And while sometimes you will see the exact commands in documentation, oftentimes you'll see exact commands in documentation. For the point of this exercise, we want to keep it high level, right? So like we want to just say what we want our code to do. We're not diving into, hey, const express equals require, all of that stuff. So to summarize, and sometimes, by the way, you will already have these steps done and you want to document it afterwards. So let's rely on work we have already done. As I rapidly pull Windows off the window I was sharing to make sure I don't have any code from work up, because that would be an intellectual property violation. Okay, no, we're good. All right, so I'm gonna pull up my server.js and close out of my terminal because I don't need that. Okay, so first thing we did, I would consider these first 6 lines all kind of set up, right? So we are going to say set up express body parser and cores. And then I can do another step of add root level route. So our hello world. And then we want to get our server listening on port. And then we want to probably test our root level endpoint or route. Endpoint, route tend to be synonymous terms. There may be slight variations in the differences, but they tend to be interchangeable. Okay, so that's a lot that we did there, but we just said, all right, we want to get our Express set up, and we know we're going to have to do cores and body parser and all of that good stuff. Let's get hello world working. So when we just go to localhost 3001, something shows up. Let's get our server listening and make sure that there aren't any problems there. And then let's go test our root level endpoint. Let's go actually load localhost 3001 and make sure it's working. I forgot a step in there. What did I forget? Res.send stuff, I would consider that all in my root level route, right? In order for that to work, I'm going to have to res.send some information back. Open localhost, I would consider that all kind of as part of our test, but you're close, Susan. We need to not only open localhost, we need to make sure that localhost is running on our port. So we need to remember that after we add our server listening on the port, we need to start our server from the terminal. And if you want to leave notes in here like npx nodemon, that's a completely fine thing to do. Okay, so we've got like our server set up, right, in our code time. So I'm actually going to go back and amend this. So instead of it just saying code time, I'm going to say like server code setup. Right, because that's all everything in that section is. It's all on the server. Okay, we've got all of that working. Now we want to actually get our database wired up. So we're going to say database code connection. Okay, so let's hop back over to our code. What did we do? We pulled in PG. We got this client open and we connected to it. All right, that's a lot that's going on there, but I can summarize that all together of connect to the database using PG package. And there's nothing saying I can't go back and reference this code. And if we were being super thorough in our documentation, you know, I could copy this and paste it in my documentation and save it as a little code snippet. But because Google Docs isn't always the best for storing code, I'm going to skip that step. Nothing saying that if you were writing up your own documentation, you couldn't provide, you couldn't, you know, add that code in there. Okay, so we've got our database connected. The next thing we want to do is probably commented out here. We want to run a test query. And the reason we want to run that test query is because we not only have opened that connection, we want to prove that we can send a query to the database and get a query back. So we are going to run a test query and console log results. And we can do, you know, we can add a note in there to basically say, oh, we use our select now to just generically select something. Okay, we've got all of that created. We know our end objective here is something with CRUD, right? So let's go back to our data. Let's go back to our code, and you'll notice there are conveniently 4 endpoints here. There is a get, a post, a put, and a delete. And so what I'm going to do when I create a backend, when I'm not interacting with the front end and saying, all right, let's just get everything working, I stub out my 4 REST methods. Yes, I brain farted on what those things were called. What we mean by those is our get, our post, our put, and our delete. And so when I say stub them out, I mean create routes and endpoints to put our DB code into. So basically, I'm just going to create those 4 routes, right? I'm going to create my messages with my get, my post, my put, and my delete, just so I've got a place to drop in that code. And then when I see them empty, I know, oh, that's something that I need to go in and get working for us. Okay, from here, what would I do next? I can't test them yet because I don't actually have any code in them. I've literally just created our 4 endpoints, but they're not doing anything yet. So where would I start after that? I need to add my data. Yeah. So we already created our table shawl. And if I scroll up, I can see that I created my first table up here. And so maybe it's worthwhile adding create first table with appropriate structure. because we're going to need to know what kind of data we're storing, right? Whenever we create a table, we don't just name the table, we also specify what the column names are and the data types. So down here, in order to be able to pull any data out, we need the ability to put some data in. So the first endpoint that I'm going to create is add SQL to insert row into table and send back results. Then I'm going to test it. And I can specify here either in Postman or in my front end, right? And I'm aware that if we were doing a front end for this, there would be another section of steps, and maybe we'll get to that if there's extra time. But right now, we're just going to focus on our Postman. And by the way, if you are vigorously taking notes on exactly what I'm typing, I promise I will share this document with you guys. Or I'll just hoard it and say, this is all for me. Okay, then we test it. Okay, well, I think we are getting to the point where we can rinse and repeat. The next thing we probably want to be able to do is, let me just clarify this in our post request. Then we want to be able to make sure that that is actually working. So maybe after we test it, we can check in Beekeeper Studio to make sure data in table matches what we expect. Because it's entirely possible that we've got a null coming in or something's getting sent up that, you know, it's not making it through the back end properly, or there's some weirdness going on there. Okay, once we do that, now we can start rinsing and repeating. We need to make get request work with select query and test. Then we need to make our put request work with our what kind of query? Not edit. What do we do in the database? How do we edit data in the database? What's the SQL command for that? Not insert. We're editing existing rows. We update. And then we should test that. And then finally, we should make our delete request work with our what kind of query? Drop. No, I'm just kidding. Delete query. If we use delete with a drop query, we would delete the whole table. And as we showed last night with SQL injection, that is probably not something we want to allow users to do. Okay. Poor little Bobby tables. All right. Are there any steps in this process or any steps from last night and last night's process that are not in here that we should probably add to the documentation? Scroll up a little bit just so. I'm gonna open a new tab and make sure I can add you guys to this document. Oh, come on. Okay, decide not to copy that for me. That's cool. There we go. Okay, so as long as you, I will put, oh, sorry, Latonia, I did not mean to send that just to you. Okay, now everyone should have that. I will put it in the resources channel in Slack, and then I will also put it in Google Classroom as well. If I can remember where in Google Classroom the resources are, because I've been a bad teacher and not been adding to that list. It's the resource list : module number, right? When you said add that to the Google Classroom's resources list, is that where it is, or is there something else? Okay, so let me create that module 8 resources, add to module 8, and say that, grab this from here, make it so just in case you are not part of the group, you can still see it, and drop that in there. Okay, posted in all 3 locations. Now that you've had a chance to think, anything else that popped in your head that was not on the list? All right, well, thanks to my excellent teaching and this list, I'm sure you guys can do all of this off the top of your head now without using the video from yesterday. So I'll leave the rest, an hour and a half of the class, for you guys just to go through and pull this stuff off. Totally kidding. We are going to go through step by step and go through each one of these. But what we want to be asking as I go through, because one of the things last night was I'm like, I know I'm losing you guys, but I'm not hearing any questions, right? And that's a tough thing for me to be like, I don't know if I should keep going here or what's going on. So what I want you guys to be thinking of is, now that we've got this list documented and we have the what we want to be doing in the second half of class is the why, right? Of while we are going through all of these steps, why did he write that line of code? What step does that match in the document? And let me make sure I understand why he's writing that line of code. And sometimes that why you can't figure out unless you have all of the what's listed out, right? Because you may understand the why for a lot of these steps, but unless you see it in that bigger picture, you can't get to the understanding level of it, right? And so hopefully this list is helpful, not just in terms of, oh, now I can go follow these steps. It's also helpful for you guys to know, oh, I can write my own documentation. I do want to plan out my project before I dive into it, right? And so while you will get to the point where you don't need to write out these steps because you have them all memorized, being able to write them out, even for a fellow employee, is going to be super helpful. So we are going to take a break. This is the first break I'm actually giving you guys without an assignment to do. So you will have a full, we'll give you 20 minutes. So let's take a 20-minute break. We'll regroup at 7:20 and we'll start knocking through this stuff.
You need to add test under delete.
Oh, no, we don't like to test deletions. We just let that go. Thank you for that. Jahil, great question. You guys can feel free to take your breaks. Jahil, it is required to document at my job. Unfortunately, documentation is a hard thing to assess whether or not you're doing it well or not. And oftentimes you think you are writing the world's best documentation until someone goes to use it. And then they have no idea what you're trying to say. So definitely documentation is important. I would say one of the top 5 skills I'm looking at during interviewing is communication, because you could be the world's best developer, but unless you can tell me what you're working on and where you're stuck and how long it's going to take you to get through that, you're probably not going to be a good member of my team. Like you could be Steve Wozniak, and I wouldn't care unless you were able to communicate to me what you're working on and how the project is going. I can't really say whether it's weekly or daily. There are definitely times that I am working on features that I write documentation before I build it. There are times that I build out an entire feature and go, oh God, I really need to document this so I don't hate myself if anyone else comes back to it, including myself. There are all different kinds of documentation. There is documentation at the code level. So if another engineer comes in and is trying to, bug fix or add to that feature, they're going to want some code level documentation to understand it. There is project level documentation of like, how is all of this supposed to work? What's the architecture of all of this? Like, what kind of databases are you connecting to? What's the point of this project? What's it supposed to be able to do? There is user level documentation of, oh, I built this feature, but users probably need to know how to do it. So I need to come out of my engineer's brain and think from a actual user, how they're going to use this and what the instructions are on it. There is project planning documentation, which is what I was mentioning I was working on today at work, of here are all of the things this feature is supposed to do. And I need to be able to document all of that so I, as a manager, can hand that off to my engineers and my engineers know what to build. Caitlin, are there any other types of documentation that I am missing that you use at work? Jahiel, in answer to, oh, go ahead, Caitlin.
No, which ones did you say? Sorry, I was trying to get this resource file situated.
Did I drop it somewhere where it was not supposed to be?
No, like it's gotta be like a sheet. There's like a sheets file for every module. You could just put links. And stuff. I think it's that one. It's fine. I was gonna like add a bunch of stuff to it, but anyway.
Any kind of documentation types that you use at work?
We have like a shared drive that has just like a lot of typed up documentation depending on the project. It's actually one of our big projects at work is updating documentation and also just like straight up writing documentation for things that don't have it. Or when I was onboarded, they like used me as a guinea pig. They're like, okay, here's like where you can find how to do something. Look through this document, and if you get stuck, let me know where and why, and then we'll update the documentation so it's more clear. So like that was really fun because
that is unfortunately a very common process for a new hire of like, oh, yeah, you're the first person we've hired for this team in a while, or like you're the first person we brought in. So yeah, here's all of this stuff. Let us know what you need help on, and then we'll go write documentation for that help.
Yep. Luckily, a lot of it was Joey's documentation, which was actually very thorough and pretty easy to follow. But some of it too, like it's when you're actually first hired, it's kind of off topic, but the documentation you're asked to follow is kind of foreign no matter what, because you are unfamiliar with a lot of the things the company uses or does, or the platforms they use or the tools they use. And so like, it's just like, it's a process. It takes a while. It took at least a couple of weeks to get everything set up and, work out a lot of the kinks. And then when I was onboarded to a new project, to the website project after the new website launched, that was a whole new process also. It was a whole new code base. It was, a whole thing. So yeah, there's a lot involved, but I would say like the most on the website, we use wikis. So on the web team, we have wiki documentation, like what Joey showed you when he had all like the like API endpoints and like what they do and what kind of data was in them. That's all part of like our wiki structure, which basically tells you like how each part of the site works and how each part is developed. And that is to help you as a developer figure out like what's doing what and how it's all connected. So that's a big helpful tool. What else?
So, and this is such a huge job that there is actually a job title called technical writer. And they are people who document either APIs that are public facing or write the user guides or write their job. They may not be an engineer. They're not afraid of code, but they're also not writing code off the top of their head. And their whole job is to go in and create this documentation.
One of my friends is a technical writer for Peloton, actually. He said that's been really fun.
Yeah, and companies realize that there's a need for this. And oh, turns out that the people who are writing code and, talk to each other about binary and whether tabs or spaces are more important may not be the best people to write documentation for your end users who are, looking for English and not inside nerd jokes. And so that's why the technical writer position exists, because that's going to be like an English major who happened to lean technical and understands how to write instructions. So that's a separate job role. Jahil, I don't know if you're still on and just wanted to comment. The only time I do line level comments is if I write a line of code that I've impressed myself on. And not trying to stroke my own ego there, but if I have impressed myself on it, it means that it's sufficiently complicated that I think that the next person coming to it is not going to understand what it is doing. So as beginners, I definitely recommend that you comment almost every line out, just so you can put in English words what it is doing. But when I read a code, I read a chunk of code, and it's a .map statement that's pulling out the ID. Your comments are going to get in the way of like, oh, loop over messages, access ID, and return that in a new array. It's like, well, obviously it's doing that. I just read the map. Like that's pretty clear. But if I've got this advanced function that's 100 lines of code and it's calling other functions and it's like, what's going on? I will often do a block level comment where at the top of a function, I will say, this is what the function is expected to do. These are the parameters that get passed in. Here's what gets returned from it. And do block level documentation. There's something called JSDoc, which is a standard for documenting your code using blocks right before every function. So that is a thing you can do. I will leave comments in my code. There is something called a to-do, TODO, and that is such a standard that a lot of text editors will support it. Of when I'm writing out a new feature, if I need to come back to something, but it's like a different side tangent, I'll leave myself a to-do, and I tend to initialize that. I tend to use my initials on that and the date, and then a quick summary of what I need to do. It is not a substitute for project management in terms of, figuring out what the features are, but like if I'm working on something that's going to take me a couple days and I need to come back to it, I'll use to-dos at a line level comment to do that. I will also leave block level notes inside my code of like, this needs to be refactored, but I'm not refactoring it now due to X, Y, and Z, or like, I know this looks messy, but if you think about it as this, it's probably not that messy. So lots of different nuances with documentation.
I do that as well. I actually just had to hand off a pretty big feature to another developer. And in the branch that I created for the task I was working on for the front end task, I left comments about like what I was doing, comments about what needed to be done still, where I left off, when was the last time I touched the code, and just like a general idea of like what certain things we're doing that might seem vague in code, but like make more sense if I just explain them in a couple lines of commented code. So that actually ended up being extremely helpful for her. So that's good. And then whenever you're doing something, I also will say like in your code that doesn't necessarily follow the pattern of the project. So like if you have to diverge from like specific patterning you're using for like API calls or implementing different components and things like that, if ever there's a time where you're wondering, like, is somebody going to be able to understand what I'm doing, leave a comment because it gets taken out anyway. And it's just so helpful when you're going through the code trying to debug later if something breaks. It's easier for somebody else to be like, oh, I know what this is doing and why this is here. I can continue without like spending 3 hours trying to figure out what this person was doing before. So
when Caitlin says it's taken out anyway, she means that when it's shipped out to production and deployed, the comments get stripped out. So the only people seeing your comments aren't your end users of like, oh man, I really got to go back and clean this up. This feature sucks right now. Your customers, if your deploy process is set up properly, aren't going to see your comments, but anyone going through your code, at the company will down the road.
Yeah, sorry.
Yes, your comments do not, you don't throw your comments at the computer and go, screw this, I don't care about this, and it just deletes all your comments. Jahil, you asked about me not screen sharing code that I've done for work. That technically falls under copyright, but the bigger umbrella that we like to think of that as is intellectual property. And so intellectual property is like a song you've written or a poem you've published, or there are all kinds of intellectual property. Basically, any non-tangible property can fall under intellectual property. I am sure there are other kinds of non-tangible property that do not fall into intellectual property. But when you start working at a job, it is common. It used to be they used to be called non-disclosure agreements, or NDAs. And my boss just told me last week a confidentiality agreement, where basically, hey, you're going to get access to like our clients' email addresses, or you're going to get access to data that we don't want you to share. So a confidentiality agreement is basically going to bind you to say, like, you can't use your company data for something outside of the company's task, something outside of your job description. That also covers, and then you would also sign an intellectual property agreement, which is separate from your confidentiality agreement. They can be separate or they can be interlaced, but basically saying, hey, when you're on the clock and we're paying you to do this work, we own the code that you're working on, right? Like, we're paying you to produce this code. So if you leave the company, you can't just take this code with you. Like, the whole point of us paying you a salary is so we get the code. And if you are working as a contractor, it is actually possible to have a intellectual property assignment saying, I'm just granting you a license to use this code. So if I design this beautiful website for you, I may give you a discount on the hourly rate so I can use that design with other clients. And so intellectual property is you can find intellectual property attorneys that specialize just in that field. So that is a complex field that, it's like at work. It's one thing to go, oops, I didn't mean to share that. It's another thing to go, oops, I didn't mean to share that section of code, but because we're live streaming on YouTube, that code is now public on the internet. So, I could probably go, okay, my bad. I can go in the YouTube video. I can blur out or edit out a part of that video and not have it be the end of the world. However, I have access to our production level database, which has user information in it that is HIPAA protected. So that would be a little bit harder for me to accidentally connect to in the middle of class and share that information. But that we have an entire security disclosure process that we have to go through, and we have to notify the customers of what information leaked. We have to come up with a resolution. We have to talk about how that, we wouldn't let that happen again. There are all kinds of things that we not only have to protect that information, we also have to be prepared if that information leaks out. So all kinds of headaches you get around not only data privacy, but also like, hey, all of this code I have written, I technically do not own. I've worked for Tuzag for the past 6 years now, I think, 5.5, somewhere in that time period. And the hundreds of thousands of lines of code I have written, I do not own. Tuzag owns them. The company itself owns them. It's not that my boss owns them. It's the LLC or the S Corp or the C Corp or the, the company itself that owns it. So I cannot, I have to be careful about what I open. I do all of my code in Webstorm. So whenever I open up Webstorm to reference code, I make sure I am not accidentally screen sharing in case it pops up on the wrong monitor. But there are times that I use VS Code at work just as like a secondary file editor. And that's why I'm always cautious of when those windows open of, oh, I really hope no work code is up there. Need to be careful of that. Jahil, we have a 190-page HIPAA policy document of what happens with our HIPAA data, our third-party vendors that we use, what applications we allow people who can access our HIPAA-related data are allowed to install on their computers, the security protocols that we have for data at rest, all kinds of crazy level documentation. Our database we store at Google, and we use all of Google's encryption. So we're not particularly worried about it being hacked. Hacking a database is not normally what you see from the movies. It's not, typing all kinds of crazy things in the database and give me 5 more minutes and I'll get in. And data security is a whole separate field. But fortunately, because we use a lot of Google products, not to say that it's not up to the developers to make sure that you're not secure, but it is important to think of security while you're coding and working with both your DevOps team and potentially even an information security team to make sure everything is secure. Yeah, Jahil, it would probably breach copyright. It would definitely breach something under intellectual property if I took old code that I wrote for them and copied it into new code. There are some protections around, like, there are only so many ways you could write that code, right? So like, there's only so many ways you can start a new Express server. So my old employer, well, you can legally in the US sue anyone over anything, but they wouldn't have much of a copyright case if they said like, oh, can you believe it? He went to his new job and started an Express server there. The judge is going to be like, there's only one way to start an Express server. Like, you can't claim that work done there is preventing him at the new place. But yes, you definitely have to be careful. There was a lawsuit of a Tesla employer, a Tesla employee who went and worked at a competitor, and he took like hundreds of thousands of lines of Tesla code for self-driving and brought it over to his new employer. And Tesla sued, and the employer agreed with them and said, yeah, he stole all of that code. Like, he legally can't take that. And the employee got whacked with a huge fine and got fired at his new job. $7:20, I'll give everyone a break, mainly because I should probably drink something, and then I will dive back in.
Yeah, that's unfortunate. But like, I was wondering if the guy that worked for Tesla, or like previously or whatever, like, did he actually develop the code himself and then like copied it? Or was it like he had a team or something and then he copied the code?
It doesn't matter either way, whether you're working in a team or not, that as long as the contracts are set up right when you start working at that company, it doesn't matter or not whether you wrote it or a team member wrote it or whatever it is, that code is owned by the company. So you cannot copy and paste it even if you are the one who wrote it.
Yeah, that's good information to know.
And like I said, that is not a blanket statement, right? There are companies that will hire people and not have those contracts set up. That's a good question. What happens if you create that code from scratch? And if we can find, and maybe I'll ping Jesse about this, but if we can find a intellectual like property code expert, I am sure they could fill at least a 3-hour class with the do's and don'ts and contract templates. And I do not claim to be an expert in this. I am not providing any legal advice. I am whatever other disclaimers I probably need to throw out there. I am not recommending that you use any contracts, that I am recommending whatever I need to do there. Basically, what you can do is there is certain protection of saying there are only so many ways of writing this code. If I can rewrite this code from memory and I can prove that I wrote that code while on the clock at my new employer, you can be protected, right? So like, with that said, the code that was stolen from Tesla was the self-driving code. And it was like probably 1 million lines of code, and not something that you just go like, oh, overnight, let me just write this out from memory. You know, like that's not something that you do. So, you know, if you rewrite 1,000 lines of code, something similar to what you did at your last employer, your last employer is going to have a hard time of being like, oh, he stole that, because you could say, look, it took me 40 hours to write this code. You know, I've got my Git logs of me writing it and me checking in certain parts of it. There are little variations between it, right? Like it is hard to go after that. But with the case of Tesla was like, oh, all of a sudden, as soon as you hired that employee, your self-driving program like skipped 3 years ahead of where it should have been. How did you guys do that? And was able to detect their code running over at that other place, and went, oh yeah, something's wrong here, and traced it back to the employee and all of that stuff. So the expert may be an attorney, Ariel. I'm not quite sure who would come in. I'm sure there are at least one job title at Google is basically intellectual property guru, wizard, ninja, whatever you want to throw in there. There are all kinds of things that get intertangled there of what happens if I'm using open source software. You know, Facebook created React. What happens if Facebook one day says, oh, we don't want to give you React anymore? Well, thousands of companies have written their user interfaces in React, and up until about 2 or 3 years ago, the React license said that Facebook owned it, and they could decide to pull it back, and everyone who had built an application in React would be screwed. And so Wikipedia was rebuilding their entire site in React and said, we would like to use React. We've done hours and hours of research on this, and we decided that we would like React, but we can't use it due to the licensing. And Facebook actually did a 180, changed their mind, and said, we'll license it for everyone so that isn't a concern anymore. So all kinds of complexities. You guys, I think, have hit everything I know about intellectual property. Just to give you an idea of, there's just a lot of different things out there.
Yeah, you actually answered one of the questions I wanted to ask. Like, what if a contractor wrote some code for a company, and then eventually they, I guess, became like upset at the company or something, and then they're like, all right, I'm gonna pull my code. Like the contract is up, I'm gonna pull my code from this website, I'm not gonna renew it. And then like, I was wondering, would the website like shut down because they want to have a functioning, you know, like whatever anymore? And then I was wondering, not only that, but like, has there been like cases of that? But you just mentioned it with the React situation, like, you know.
Oh yeah, there have definitely been cases. Someone deleted a package on NPM, and it prevented pretty much everyone from deploying their code that happened to use NPM for a solid 6 hours before NPM could fix the problem. And they weren't even trying to make a cascading reaction or anything. This guy was just like, oh, there's a copyright issue over one of my package names. I'm going to just delete the package. And it ended up breaking everyone's website. So there are a lot of issues. NPM has since corrected that, by the way, and has more policies in place now to prevent that from happening. But yeah, there are all kinds of intellectual property loopholes that you can get into.
Also, I was gonna say, like, I don't know, like, I guess, can people make certain code or whatever where, I don't know, like, somebody, I think I forgot, they talked about like Facebook or whatever, how they're not really, I guess, so they don't keep things private or something. They like to collect their data.
Yeah, data is a entirely separate topic of whether you're sharing data or not and who has the rights to that. And obviously that is becoming more of a hot topic issue, but I'm going to steer us back into full stack development here and out of copyright, intellectual property. Interesting discussion and happy to keep it going. But seeing that I only have an hour of class left and all of those steps that we have in that Google Doc, I don't want to get yelled at for going fast again. So I am going to curtail that conversation and switch back to our full stack dev. Okay, so I did say that we were starting from scratch. However, I am going to borrow some code we have already written because the code that I have written is open source licensed thanks to Hack Upstate. And so I have no problem copying and pasting code that I wrote last night into tonight's code. But I will talk through that code. First things first, we've got to get our database server running. So I'm going to pop open my Postgres app. And I am going to click on the start button here, and I'm going to wait until it says running up at the top. If you do have a different version number, I think I am actually on an older version. But once you have this running, go ahead and minimize it. I'm aware mine is not actually running because I run my Postgres a little differently for work. But once you hit this start button, it should say that it is running. If you have problems, raise your hand in Zoom, and I will stop as soon as I see your hand raised. So definitely stop me if you are not following along, because I am hopefully going slow enough that you guys can follow along if you want. Okay.
Max, I have a quick question. This is Latonia.
No, how dare you ask questions?
I just want to make sure. So we want to make sure it's on the Postgres icon for this, right? Because I still have the 4 when I look at my Postgres.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. As long as it says like running or started, or as long as the stop button isn't grayed out, you should be good to go. It doesn't matter what databases are showing up down here because we're going to create a new one in a second. Okay. I'm going to pop open Beekeeper Studio. And it says select a connection type. So first of all, let's go back. Database server running. We're down with step 1. Step 2, connect to the default database, the username database in our Beekeeper Studio. So I'm going to say connection type is Postgres, and the default database I'm connecting to is whatever my Mac username is. If you do not know what that is, go back to your Postgres app, and that will show you what your default database is, whatever your username is. So I'm going to hit connect on that. And I'm going to get into a query area that I can run. Okay, step 2 done. Step 3, create a new database with a unique name matching the project name. Okay, I'm going to use the very hard to remember syntax, create database to do. And I'm going to run it. And I get my query executed successfully, no results. Again, raise your hand in Zoom if I am losing you at any step, because I'm not going to do the poll tonight. Okay, we created the new database. Now we need to go tell Beekeeper Studio to go use that. Carolyn, I see you. I'll come right back to you. I'm going to pop open Beekeeper Studio after closing out of it, selecting a connection type. I'm going to do Postgres again. And then in my default database, I'm going to type in to do, because that's the database I just created. And I'm going to hit connect. And technically, I can switch between my databases up at the top here. You can see all the different databases I have created, including a couple that I use at work. So you can switch between your databases up at the top. But I like to illustrate, hey, we're closing the connection out of our default database, and we're reopening the connection on a different one. And so I am going to create a table here called to do. We'll call it to do's because plural tends to be a thing. And then we need to tell it what is going into that table. So we are going to use our ID, which is going to be a type of serial. We are going to use our, let's say, done, and make that a bool, whether it's done or not. And then we are going to call it, we'll call it name, and we will make that a text. And I guess we could do a timestamp on it as well with a timestamp property. I will amend my statement. Raise your hand in Zoom if you are following along and feel like you are following and feel like you are falling behind. Okay, so we've got our create statement. We're gonna copy, we're gonna hit run down here, and it says query executed successfully. And we're gonna come over to our to-dos app, double click, and see that we've got our ID, our done, our name, and our timestamp, and we can pop it open in Beekeeper Studio and see our schema over there. So I'm gonna grab this, I'm gonna copy not all of that, just this part after I add a semicolon. Semicolons are more important in SQL than they are in JavaScript. I am going to drop that in our pasted code channel. And I'm going to take a quick breath to see if anyone has questions. So we are up until step 5 here. Yes, we went fast. Yes, we did that in under 5 minutes. But what we want to do is not only know that we're following along, but we understand how we did each one of these steps and what we did to actually get those steps to happen.
Can I ask a quick stupid question?
Only if it's a stupid one.
It's definitely dumb because I know what we just did and I followed along and I did it yesterday and I did it again today when I watched the video. But what is number 1? Database server running. I don't like that means nothing to me when I just look at it. Do you know what I mean?
So not a stupid question.
Okay.
If we go to our Postgres app, we hit the start button.
Oh, so see for me, and this is what you're talking about documentation, that should say start to me, open Postgres start button or whatever.
Yeah. And so
Right.
you could make a copy of this documentation. And there is a debate around documentation around like, well, what if it makes sense to me, but not to someone else? And that defeats the whole point of the documentation. So you could say, you know, I may add in here database server running in Postgres app. And hopefully that makes it a little bit more clear. But there are definitely times that the documentation will make sense to someone and not to someone else. And that's just a hard thing to get around.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I got it.
Maybe start database server in Postgres app would be more accurate. Kyle, we may not have shut it down last night. Shutting down your computer will shut down the server. And in fact, that's why I can't use the Postgres app, is because I've got my computer configured to automatically start the server whenever it turns on and shut it down whenever I turn my computer off, which gets into different kinds of headaches. But it is entirely possible. It is entirely possible that it was running from last night, and that's fine. There's no problem with that. These database servers are engineered to run for not months, but years at a time. And so while our local computer environment may not be the best environment to run a server, these servers are built to run for years and years on end without having any downtime. Okay. Any questions? Okay. I am going to leave Beekeeper Studio open, but I'm going to pop open my VS Code. I'm going to go to File, Open, and I'm going to go to my code folder in Module 8. realizing that I created files yesterday in day 4 that actually should have been called day 3. So, oh, stop that. I'm going to quickly rename that folder so I don't confuse the heck out of myself. And then I'm going to create a new folder called day 4. And I'm only working with my backend, so I'm not going to create another folder in there. But if I were to create a front end for this, I would create a separate folder for my backend, separate from my front end. Okay, I guess I will save whatever changes I made there. Okay, I am going to right click and open an integrated terminal. And now it's not a good time to update, so I'm going to hit no on that. Okay. We created our folder for our backend. We open VS Code and the matching terminal, and we are now npm initting. So I'm going to pop over here. I'm going to npm init -y. Gonna regret not drinking that coffee that I made. Okay, I've got my package.json in here. I don't know where this server file came from. Very confused. Let me just take all of that and put it somewhere else. That file like appeared out of nowhere, and I'm not quite sure if I had something else open that copied it over, but pretend like that file was never there because it shouldn't have been there. Okay. Did anyone else end up with a server file out of the blue? Okay, yeah, that's just my computer being weird. Okay, so we npm initted, and now we need to npm install all of these packages. And this is a point where I read my documentation and realize I forgot something. In my npm install, I forgot my -s. So I'm just going to modify my documentation to have that. I'm going to copy this, come over here, paste it. And it is going to install all of that good stuff for me. While that is installing, I'm going to go over to step 5, which is create my file called server.js. I'm going to right click here and make my new file. I'm going to say server.js. Okay. Yeah, you can, depending on how you organize your code, Mel, you can call this to-dos backend. That is a descriptive name that is fine to use. I happen to call mine day 4, but to-dos backend would probably be a better name than day 4. We aren't going to create a front end for this just for the sake of time, which is why I didn't worry about too much about labeling it. Yeah, this is not chat, Carolyn. We are doing to-dos here as a completely separate example. Mother. How did it end up in? I have angered the coding gods, and they are creating files that I did not put in there. Does my day 3 have my backend? Okay. I've got a gremlin in my computer. It happens. I'm moving it out of the chat backend file and moving that out. Okay. Hopefully I don't get any ghost files appearing. I don't know what I've done. I think I have another VS Code open somewhere, and it is creating files in folders I have deleted. I'm not quite sure what's going on, but my package.json has everything I need in it. So hopefully we'll be good to go from this point forward. Sorry for the confusion. Okay. Got our server.js. We're in my day 4. If you want to call it to-dos backend, that's also fine to do. Pun not intended, but appreciated. Okay. I'm going to come back to my documentation. And now not only am I going to make sure that I've got all of this done, but I'm also making sure that I haven't forgotten any of the steps up here and making sure I'm comfortable with those as well. So I'm going to take a breath and let anyone raise their hand in case anyone has a question. Okie doke, we're steamrolling forward. So we need to set up our Express, our body parser, and our courts. Okay, well, I've kind of done all of that. I did all of that last night. And that's a pretty common thing, right? You're going to do that across all of your projects, right? If I took that code from work and used it over here, I wouldn't worry about like my work suing me for stealing code, because like the way you set up an Express server is pretty much the same every time. So I'm going to just paste in that code from our code from last night. I will also put it in the pasted code channel. But just because I'm pasting code does not mean that I shouldn't skip over the why are we using that code. So what we're doing, we had Express from NPM. We're requiring it. We're getting access to Express. We are using that Express package down here to create our server. We are then pulling in our cores package and saying to our Express server to use the cores package. So we pretty much disable cores. We are then pulling in body parser from NPM. We are we have a const so we can access that variable. And then we are telling the server to also use the body parser, but body parser needs a little bit more than cores. We need to tell it, hey, we're going to be sending some JSON in. Okay. Questions? Okay, going to go back to here. I set up my Express, my body parsers, and my core. I need to add a root level route, right? My hello world. So I'm going to come over here. I'm going to do my app.get. I'm going to do parentheses. I'm going to tell it that it is going to show up at just slash, which is the root of my route. And then I am going to say recres in parentheses and do my little function in here. And I'm just going to res.send. Hello world, my API is running. Okay, save. Gonna come back over here. I added my root level route. Now I need to add my server listening on a port. So I'm gonna jump over here and I am going to, oh, I shouldn't be using app. I should be using server. Sorry, that was my bad. Server, because that's what we set up from Express. It is a common naming convention to call your server app, because you're creating an Express app, but it doesn't matter. Whatever you call it up here is what you want to continue, what you want to be consistent. Okay, so I'm going to server.listen, and I'm going to server listen on 3001. You need to make sure that I don't have any other servers running on 3001 in different terminals, because otherwise it will yell at me and it will tell me 3001 is already in use. And I am going to do a quick function in here to console log server is running on 3001. I'm going to save. Going to pop back to my instructions, and I need to start my server from the terminal using npx nodemon. So I'm going to come over here and I am going to run in the correct folder, which I'm going to right click, open an integrated terminal. I am going to pwd just to make sure that I'm actually in my day 4 folder and that ghosts are not still out to get me. Carolyn, yes, you can run a port on any you can run a server on any non-used port. There are over, I think, 100,000 ports that are available for you to use. There are other ports that you cannot use, like port 80, because they are probably already taken. Port 80 is what the HTTP internet runs over. So yes, you can use 3002, 3003, 3004, whatever you want. Okay, so I'm going to npx nodemon, and I'm going to run my server.js. And I have my servers running on 3001. So I'm going to come back here to my last step, which is test my root level endpoint or my route. So I'm going to open a new tab. I'm going to go to 3001, get my hello world. My API is running. I'm going to take my code. I'm going to edit my last message in Slack. So you have my entire code, and I'm going to take a breath, and I'm actually going to start a poll here and make sure everyone is caught up to this point. And that question should not only say, were you able to get your code working? It should say, were you able to get your code working? Do you understand all of the code that is now working? And then vote.
Hello, Max. Did you see my question in the chat? This is Latonia. It's not phrased as a question, but it is. I got an error message that says that.
What is the message above that?
Require stack, and then it has the user path to server.js. Above that, it just says code : module not found.
Okay, so that means you missed an npm install. There is something that you are requiring that you do not have npm installed.
Okay, I'll go back and check. Thank you.
No problem.
Is that the same as if it says it cannot find like the whole file path and it says index.js?
Yes, that means your terminal is either you're in the wrong terminal folder, or it means that your file is not called index, it's called server or app.
Oh,
or
I think I
something like that.
clicked in the wrong spot. It's hard to tell like how far indented it is. Okay, I realize what I did. Thank you.
Yep, no problem.
Max, what is the body parser for again?
The body parser is what takes the JSON string coming in our body of the request and converts it into a JavaScript object that we can easily work with. So you can think of that as json.parse for our rec.body.
Okay, thank you.
Why do they do a line through on that?
They're cranky because I used, it says, if you hover over it, it says body parser is depreciated. It's VS Code being dumb. Body parser itself is not depreciated. The body parser that is built into Express is depreciated, but VS Code isn't being smart enough to realize that I'm requiring it in from a package. So VS Code is trying to warn me, hey, you're using some old Express code. When the fact of the matter is I am actually pulling it in from the right place and it's not actually depreciated.
Oh, okay.
It's a technical answer, but it's basically VS Code warning me of something that is not actually a problem.
Right.
There is a Express changed their mind. They removed the JSON parser that was built into Express. And then realized so many people use it that they built it back into Express. So there is actually a way of using a JSON parser where you don't have to install the body parser package. But this package is installed like 2 million times a week. So I have no concerns about continuing to use it.
Okay.
But yeah, it's just VS Code trying to be helpful and telling me that I'm using old code that I'm actually not. Okay, I've got 11 people voting.
Can I just double check real quick? Did we do anything after we ran the server so that we saw server running on port, what have you?
The last thing we did after that was we went to the browser and we went to localhost 3001 and made sure that we got our endpoint.
Great, thank you.
And to know that we did that, we can go back to our instructions and see that we have to test our root level endpoint. Okay. I'm going to keep going. I'm going to assume that 11 people is most people, unless someone unmutes or shoots a message in the chat and goes, no, wait, I'm coming. Okay. All right. So next up, we need to connect our database to the connect to the database using our PG package. I thought for a second it said connect to the database using our database. So it's like, what? Okay. Over here, before we have any of our endpoints, we probably want to get our database working because we're going to be using our database in pretty much all of our endpoints. So what we are going to do is borrow all the code that we wrote last night, but we're going to talk through it to make sure we understand what's happening with it. So we are requiring PG, which is our Postgres package we installed. We're pulling the client out of our PG package, and then we are creating a new client to connect to using my Max Matthews username. Make sure to change that to yours. And the database we're connecting to is To-Do, which is the database that we did create database and then named over in Beekeeper Studio. We have our new client, we've got our DB, and we've got our DB Connect, because once we connect to the data, once we have our client, we need to actually tell it to connect. And then we are going to run a select query to just make sure we get our time back. So I'm going to save, and I'm going to get a huge block in my console. And one of them is going to have my rows and the current date and time, which is exactly what I want. So I'm going to comment this out. I'm going to grab all this code and update it in Slack. And I'm going to hop over to my instructions and see not only did we connect to the database, but we did our test query and got our select now working.
Max, Ariel had a question in chat. Oh, she has her hand up also.
Ariel, go ahead.
It's the same thing. What was the PG we did prior with our NodeMon then, or our cores?
When we did our npm install, we installed a bunch of different things: Express, cores, body parser, and PG.
Right. Okay.
And so we are using the PG we just installed, and that's the first time we're using it.
We're just not adding it like we did last night because we added it to body parser.
No, we added PG this way last night too.
Okay, then maybe I just did not add it that way last night. All right, thank you.
The only reason I can say that with certainty is because I literally just copied and pasted that code in from last night's code.
So Max, regarding the code from last night, you went through and just everything we hadn't already copied in, you copied it in, because I have comments in mine. So I'm just trying to figure out what I needed. So just everything.
Feel
Okay.
free to copy that in. I copied all the way down to line 13 of my code, but basically before we started using those endpoints, before we started setting up the slash messages and all of that stuff, everything above that is what I have copied in from last night, with the exception of changing our database name to To-Do.
And Max, the PG is for Postgres, right?
Correct. That's the name of the npm package we use to connect to Postgres.
Perfect, thanks.
And I just missed the last step to see how you got that in your terminal, the info.
That's
Oh,
the
before
DB
you
query
marked it
select
out,
now.
you ran the test.
Correct.
Okay. I had it commented out. Okay,
Cool.
try it.
I'm gonna relaunch the poll just to make sure I think everyone is where I think they are.
Does it matter if you put the server listening code at the bottom? Like, can that pretty much be?
Good question. I would leave it at the bottom because it makes sense that you would like to create your endpoints before you get your server listening for different endpoints coming in. My gut wants to tell me it doesn't really matter as long as you put it after you create the server from Express, but it is definitely considered best practice to put it at the bottom. And we will, I think we will get to the point where we have multiple files in our, we definitely will. Next week, we will get to the point where we have multiple files in our backend. And so it won't just be server.js. We're going to need other files to pull in. The error is kind of required for testing, Mel, because otherwise we don't have access to the res because the order of the parameters matters. So what we really should be doing in here is saying if there is an error, then console.error, the error, else handle our response. That's probably better error handling because if something didn't go wrong, we would want this line in there to see what was actually in the error response. So probably good to add that in. So it's only required because we can't get to the res as the second parameter unless we pass in the first parameter. But good to add error handling in here so we can actually see the error if something goes wrong. We can use try catch finally. We want to be careful of using try catch finally when we're not using async await code, because the way we handle errors in callbacks is different than the way we handle errors in async await code. Async await code will let us use try catches. In the callbacks, we want to be careful that the error is not a separate object as opposed to an actual error that is being thrown. If you remind me sometime next week, Shaw, I will show you an error that we get in the database and how we can try catch it in async await code. Okay, hop back to our list. We've got our test query working. Now we want to stub out the 4 methods. And this is a common thing. Basically, we're saying we just want to like get everything in there and create holes to drop our code into. So I'm going to come back over here and I'm going to server.get /messages /todos, excuse me, todos. And I'm going to do an async rec res because I know I'm going to be working with the database in there. And then I never want to create a endpoint or a route that doesn't res.send something back. So I'm going to throw my res.send in there as well, just so I have it all set up. Then I'm going to copy this and I'm going to paste 1, 2, 3, 4 times total and change my get to a post. And then my post to a put. And then my final get, I'm going to make a delete. Then I will throw line spaces in here and be good to go back to my instructions. So again, server.get, and then I just rapid fired my get, post, put, and delete. Just so we are ready to rock and roll right in here. Okay, I'm gonna come over here, stub out my methods, create routes and endpoints to put our DB code into. All right, we did that. We are all set up now. We can get rocking and rolling. Add SQL to insert row into table and send back results in post. Okay, so we're gonna come over here. We're gonna work in our post, and we are going to do await our DB query. And the reason we need our await is because our queries always run asynchronously. We want to wait for that query to be done before we do anything else. And what is our query going to be? Our query is going to say insert into our to-dos table. And what columns do we want to target? That's a good question. Let's go back over to Beekeeper Studio. See if I can get this over here so I can still see them maybe. Yes. Okay. I don't want to target my ID because that's going to be automatically generated by the database. But I do want to target done, name, and my timestamp. And what values do I want to put into those? I would like to put false in because that to do is not done yet. I would like to put the name in, which is probably going to come from my rec.body.name because we want the person to send in the name of the to-do that they want to create. And then I am going to add in my timestamp as now. But once we create those, we always want to send back all the tasks, all the to-dos that we have. So we are going to say const to-dos is equal to await, and then we're going to do another DB query that is going to say select everything from my to-dos. And these to-dos are actually going to come back in this thing called rows. And so what we actually want to send back is our to-dos dot rows. Because the query, the PG, returns all kinds of things like the row count, what kind of command we were running, what fields are in it, and really the data that's coming back in the select is going to be in this thing called rows.
Hey, Max, you explained yesterday how we knew that we were using the row. Can you just say that again?
Yeah, so when you look at, like, if I console log out my to-dos here, it's going to look something similar to this object down in the console that we had when we ran our select now. And basically what it's doing is it's returning all kinds of information about the query I just ran. It's returning that it was a select query. It's returning that there was only one row that came back. It's returning all the different fields that came back in that result. But we don't really care about any of that. We just care about the rows, because the rows is what actually has our data in it. And so that's why we are saying, hey, PG, it's great that you're returning all of that information about the query, but I really want the query results. And the query results happen to be in an object called rows. So I'm going to save this. I'm going to go to Postman. Didn't think I was pulling that out of my back pocket, did you, tonight? I am going to come over to my Postman. And I am going to say, hey, my localhost 3001, that's what I want. I'm going to go to my to-dos. I'm going to switch over to my body and make sure it is set to raw and JSON in here. And I am going to send a body that has a name in it. So I'm going to say name, my very first to do. Pull this over. I'm going to hit send. And I get a connection refused on 3001. So I'm going to pop back over here. I'm going to make sure it's saved. I'm going to scroll down and I've got an error. And it says error is not defined because I broke this up here. That should just say ERR because it's matching whatever the parameter is up here. So I'm going to scroll down. I'm going to see my time is still logging out. So I'm actually going to go up and console all of that out because I don't want my time to show up every time my server starts. Oops. Comment, save. All right, my server is running. I come over here. I hit send. Not only did I get this lovely response with all of my to-dos, but I can go to Beekeeper Studio and double click on my to-dos and see my very first to-do is in there. Okay. Gonna grab all my code. It is now up to date in Slack. Gonna pull this down so you guys can see that code. And I'm going to relaunch the poll.
Max, I was fixing something. Can you show the Postman step again?
Sure can. So in Postman, I changed this to post, first of all, because we are creating a new to-do. My URL is localhost 3001/to-dos. Then I came over to the body tab. I click raw, and then in this drop down here, I changed it to JSON, which is what is telling body parser, hey, we are actually sending in JSON, so be prepared to parse that out. And then in my body, I put my JSON name as the key, and then the value is whatever we want it to be. I hit send, and not only should I get my response down here, but I should be able to go to Beekeeper Studio and see whatever I typed in here should show up in my database as well.
It is so cool how all these different tools communicate as one and kind of speak the same language, if you will, pardon the pun.
And that is why our stack is so interchangeable, right? It doesn't matter if we're doing this in Node.js or PHP or Ruby or whatever language you are creating your backend in. Those are all set up to talk to the database. So these are really designed to be modular and so that you can pick and choose different pieces of the stack.
I mean, this just hit me just now, how cool that is. Thank you.
If you have an error, say what the error is. If you are stuck or don't know what some code is doing, pipe up now and ask questions. Otherwise, I will give you guys a minute. Because the reason I can give you a minute is because we are already down to step 5. Actually, step 6. We checked in Beekeeper to make sure that was all working. So the only things we have to do is the last 3 queries. This more valuable to leave up or the VS Code?
I missed the beekeeper step is just like a select.
Yeah, if you go over to Beekeeper, you could do a select. That would accomplish the same thing. If you double click on to-dos here, it will open up the table without you even having to write the select.
Oh, there it is. Thank you.
I'm going to leave this up because the code is shared in Slack, but if you have any questions, feel free to ask.
I have one other question. I feel like this has been asked before, but I can't remember the reason. I only have 8 headers and you have 9. There was nothing you changed in that, was there?
There was not. I cannot tell you why I have 9 headers.
It's probably not important then.
It probably is not important. The only important header to really understand here is the content type application JSON. And that's what gets set when we hit that drop down and select JSON. That's the only really important one because that is telling Express, hey, JSON is coming in as a string. Body parser, please make this into an object so I can use it. That's probably the most important one to understand here. That is not to say that the other headers are not as important, just in terms of understanding. That's the only important header to make sure you understand.
Okay, it's the cache control that I don't have, so.
That may be some way I've got my Postman set up or something I've changed when I don't know. Can't tell you. There's a go to. Oh yeah, that's in my settings. Apparently I've got a send no cache header turned on. Definitely not important now, and definitely could not tell you why I turned that on in the first place. All right, we've got 8 votes in. Gonna wait until we get 1 more in, but if you have questions, let me know because I know we went fast. Ariel, shoot.
So somewhere towards Postman, I have a socket hang up error.
Okay, so that is saying that the port is probably not available. So go ahead and share your screen.
That one or this? Oh no, I think so.
Terminal.
That was
Okay,
not
so
prior. So where did I?
So we've got an app crash, but let's scroll up a little bit. And we've got a relationship to do's does not exist, which means that we've got an issue in Beekeeper. So let's go back over to Beekeeper.
I gotta find it. Okay.
And
I missed this step.
No, I don't think so. Because you've got your to-dos table over on the right. So I think I know what your problem is. Let's go back to your node code. And go back to Beekeeper. Sorry, I'm bouncing you around. Yeah, so you created your to-dos table in what database?
It's under query 1 instead of the named one, right?
Nope, look in the top left. What database are we in?
Under mine.
And what database should we be in?
I thought when I switched it over, it should have been the to-do one.
So
So,
it doesn't look like your to-dos database got created because it would be in that dropdown if it was.
so I created this, but I
You
didn't actually
created the
create correct
table, but not
database.
the database, correct?
Okay, so how far back would I have to go to fix that, or do I have to redo the entire thing now?
Nope, very, very quick fix. Just for the sake of time, I'm gonna request remote control.
Yep.
What we're gonna do first is we are going to drop the table because we don't want to leave things in your generic default database. So I'm just gonna cut that code and drop table to-dos. And if I hit refresh over here, it's gonna get rid of that. Then I am going to create database to do. And to do already exists apparently. So I'm going to hit the refresh button up here. And now when I go into this dropdown, I actually see I have my to do database. So I'm going to switch the connection over to do and then create the table in this database.
But I didn't have that prior, right? So I did not, you just created that. I did not have that prior.
You had the to do database created. You just created the table in the wrong database.
All right, that sounds like me. That checks out. Okay, so if I go now to, sorry, I took that back there.
So if you stop your server and start it back up again,
As in Control C?
yep, you have to click in the terminal first.
Not right now, PJ. Okay.
And then up enter to restart it.
What did you say? I'm sorry.
Up enter.
Up enter.
The up arrow key. Yep, that just restarts your last command.
Okay.
Now your select is running for your timestamp check. But let's go back over to Postman
Okay.
and hit send. And it's gonna well, you see how we have our name undefined? That's
Mhm.
because we didn't tell it we were sending JSON in. So we need to change our drop down right here to say JSON.
Okay.
And then the last thing we need to do is put our name in quotes because JSON, the keys have to be quoted as well.
The actual name key in quotes.
Yes. And now if you hit send and scroll down a little bit, your very first to do.
Oh, instead of undefined. Okay, thank you.
All right. So we got that working. Now we need to just get our select query working. So I am going to share my screen. I'm going to come back. And again, we are make a get request work with the select query. Well, if I go back to my code, I kind of already have my select query working, right? Like I would like to reuse that. And you know what? It's returning to-dos.rows. So I'm going to take this whole thing and I'm going to create a new function called get to-dos. And it is going to be async because we need to have our await code work. And that is going to return our to-dos.rows. And that means now whenever I would like to get my to-dos, all I need to do is await my get to-dos. Okay, that's pretty cool. Let's prove that it's working by copying this whole code, putting it in my get request. Coming over here, I'm going to change my post to a get. Should probably clear out my body because, you know, it's a get request. It shouldn't have a body. I'm going to hit send. And boom, there are my to-dos. Okay. So I made my get request and I tested. All right, we're on a roll here. We're going to finish this sucker off. We're going to go down to our put request. and we are going to say await db.query, and we are going to update our to-dos, and we are going to set the name of the to-do equal to whatever is in the rec.body.name, where the ID is equal to, and we can pull ID from a couple different places. It's traditional to pull it from the route, but there's nothing saying we can't pull it from the body as well. So let's pull it from there, where the ID is equal to rec.body.id. I'm going to save, and then I'm going to borrow my get to-dos magic, and I'm going to put that in my res.send as well, because all 4 of these are always sending back all the to-dos. So I'm going to save, come over here, I'm going to put my name is equal to edited, where my ID is equal to 1. And I'm not going to forget my quotes on ID. And I am going to hit send, and I get edited back. Not only did I get edited back, but I can go into my Beekeeper Studio and close out any open tabs and double click on to-dos, and there's my edited. All right, I know I'm going fast, but I want to finish this off. I'm going to come down to here, and I'm going to still res.send like always, but I just need to run my last query to delete from to-do where my ID is equal to my rec.body.id. And save that, pop over here, change my put to a delete, and remove my name out because we're not really using that anymore. And I'm going to send, and I get my empty array. That's it. That's all I'm teaching tonight. Get it working and get out. Code is in Slack. I'm going to pull this down just so the code screen share is good. I keep on editing the same message in Slack, by the way, so that's why you're not seeing new ones in there. It's the one I just pasted in should have everything. So in addition to this homework, your weekend homework will be to get this working and then to get the chat app working as well. And then Khan Academy. And those will be your 3 assignments. I have the assignments created for the chat app and for Khan Academy. If you get your Khan Academy done and you're seeing all your checks there, feel free to go to Google Classroom and just mark it as complete. If I haven't already given you a score, and I'll just go check in Khan Academy, make sure everything is checked over there, and then give you credit for that in Google Classroom. I will also give everyone their weekly scores on probably Tuesday. We will see if I can actually have some self-control and take a day off on Monday. But office hours tomorrow at 7:30. Bring your questions. And that's it.
Can I ask a quick question about some of this code here?
Sure can.
So in your server put line, that area there, and then you went, update to do, set name, blah, blah, blah. And then you went where ID, and you said you put in the body because you
just to be different.
So if you didn't want the body, you would just do rec.id and it would be fine?
No, we would have to put ID up here. And then we would do rec.params.id.
Okay.
So I'll actually leave it that way, only because I'm using it in the body for my delete. It's better to do that for consistency reasons of using one or the other, but it's just to convey that we can pass the ID in as a param, or we can pass the ID in as coming from our route. I'm actually going to put it back for consistency, but either way, it doesn't matter if you're pulling that in as a route param. You could make it a get param if you really wanted to, or you can do it in the body.
Okay.
Max, I just had a quick question about I'm sorry, my mind's blanking on what they're called, but the $ curly braces, the temperate literals,
Yes.
that the body name is in single quotes, but the body ID is not in quotes.
Yeah, so the quotes are for SQL. They aren't for the template literal. So what we're doing is because like if we wrote out the SQL query, like let me just copy and paste this into Beekeeper, which I think will make more sense. If I were to say, all right, anything with the $ and curly braces, that gets replaced, right? So the rec.body.id is going to be like where ID is 1. And then in here, my rec.body.name is going to be like my new task name. But you notice the single quotes are there because the single quotes are what make that a valid SQL statement. So the reason why they are outside of the curly braces is because it's not really part of the template literal I'm using. It's part of the SQL query that I'm trying to construct with the data coming in through the template literal.
Because the name or whatever is going to be a string where the ID is a number.
Correct. And so if, I did like my new thing here, it would be like, whoa, what's my new thing here? That's not, oh, you mean you actually want to set the entire name equal to this string, my new thing here. And then you are right. The reason why I don't have the quotes here is because it is a number. And so we wouldn't want to put quotes in. It is possible to use IDs that are not numbers, but in SQL, that is not an encouraged thing to do. And if that is kind of confusing to you on the quotes, don't worry about it too much because the way we just did this opens you up to SQL injection, which is the Bobby tables that I showed you guys last night. So there is a better way of doing this that we will trap for when we get to our object relational mapper.
So if I'm thinking about adding a database to my capstone, I probably, by the end of the databases, will not be wanting to just use this system with the regular SQL and Postgres. Okay.
But by the end of next week, you should have everything you need. So the goal is after we finish up next week with database design and the ORM, we're going to circle back to our shopping project and start creating some endpoints for the front end that you built in React with the shopping cart and connecting in a database, making the search thing work. I don't know how far we're going to go on that because an e-commerce site is obviously something that takes more than 2 weeks to build from scratch. But we're going to start talking about how we can load up our content in the database and store our products and get them showing up. And so we are going to come back to that. And then we are going to go back to some concepts in Express, like using the middleware, talking about a little bit about logging in and how we could store authentication information, verify a password, make sure that they can't access data unless they are signed in. You will cover some of that in the security module. So there will be things where I will do it and then say, don't ask questions about this. You will get more information about it later. But at the same time, I want to cover it as it relates to a full stack app because like, hey, adding a login page to my app is probably something that I might want to do at some point. And so we will cover all of that as well. Thank God there are these things called weekends where I can plan in the middle. I mean, I'm so prepared for teaching. Clearly, I am ready to go. All right, how are we feeling? It's almost 8:30. You guys survived another night. Hopefully the steps were a little clearer. Hopefully, believe it or not, we did not cover any new content tonight, even though The light bulbs probably went off more tonight than last night. Sometimes it just takes 2 passes through to do it. And so those little things like coming up with the steps before we work on them can be really instrumental. And if I teach this module again, I will keep in mind that, hey, maybe adding the front end in is a little too much right out of the gate, right? Like maybe we want to get our back end working and get it all in Postman before we start going back to our front end. But we will definitely have time with the shopping app to have more practice in React and full stack and all of that stuff. All right, I'm going to stick around for another 2 minutes in case anyone has questions. Otherwise, feel free to get out of here. I will create the Google Classroom assignment in a minute and also get that in GitHub. And then you will have everything you need for this weekend. One final reminder, office hours tomorrow at 7:30. And I think Laura is at 6 to 7. So give you a little 30-minute gap in between, and then I will see you for office hours. Sounds good.
Yep.
Go ahead, Latonia. Otherwise, everyone else can get out of here. Have a good night.
Bye, folks. Unless you're staying. Oh, you all didn't mention the feedback form, whether we're doing the big one or the 30-second. But at any rate, my question was for Caitlin or whoever. I have 5,000 things. I went through tonight. This is about committing, and I went back into my terminal, added in like the DS store, you know how we did the nano and all of that. And I did all my pushing and pulling, and for some reason it's still not changing. It keeps telling me that I have too much unsaved whatever activity, and I'm just wondering, how can I get rid of these files from just sitting here?
Can you grab an office hours with me and I'll help you through that? We basically need to stop those files from being tracked in Git because we set up the Git ignore after you had them added into Git. And there is a way to do that. It's easier if you're using source tree. I don't know if it's possible to do it in GitHub, but if you schedule a time for me, I will do my homework and then show you what homework I found and how to fix it.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry. I thought I could get it last night, and I tried a couple times and it's just not going anywhere. So.
No, I know what the problem is, and it's never an easy thing to fix. And I fixed it before. It's just one of those things that I have to Google it every time I do it. So I will Google it again and then let you know how to get it fixed.
Okay, thank you. Have a great weekend, folks.
No problem.
I have another question, right, regarding the testing.
Yep.
Up in the top with your DB query, your original like select now, just to prove that the Postgres is running.
Yes.
When it's down in the terminal, like how am I knowing that that's coming from Postgres? Like what is alerting me? Because it's the timestamp or?
Yeah, because it has the rows, and then in the rows, the timestamp is somewhat accurate.
Okay. Because that's a field that I have.
Now it's like a special command in the database where like it doesn't matter what row you have, what tables you have, what columns you have. Whenever you like select now, that is always going to return one row with the timestamp in it.
Okay.
So now it's kind of like a special command in the database that is just dropping that value in, even though you don't specify like select now from some table that I have. That's kind of the beauty of that test query, is that you can use that without even having a table created.
It's like it's just a generic like ping to make sure this is really working kind of thing.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Because if your database connection wasn't actually connected, it may not error out until you try and run your first query, and you may not have tables set up to run a test query on. And so, or data in those tables to test against. And so that's why we use that select now, because not only are you proving that you're connected to the database, but you're proving that you can get data back from the database. In this case, it happens to be the time.
Okay. I had another short question, just about databases. So I've worked at 3 different restaurants that use this one company that did scheduling.
Mhm.
So I was SBater, and then I was SBater 1, and then I was SBater 2. So that means to me that they never deleted me, right? Like each restaurant group still exists probably somewhere, and they don't delete it, they just deactivate it or something.
Yeah, so the reason why you don't want to do that, really good question, by the way. Give me 1 second to kick my dog out of the room and then I will answer that.
Is that Stella whining? I'm pretty sure I heard her like whimpering.
Sorry, I forgot my video was off. I'm back.
Okay, sorry about that. So the reason why you tend to not delete, they mentioned this really briefly in the Khan Academy videos, but they said you rarely delete data from the database. You would actually use like a deleted column and set deleted to true. The reason why you don't want to delete something like a user is, okay, well, we use a join table, right? So we're going to say like, select all the users where they work at restaurant ABC, and also select the number of hours that they have worked, right? Well, that join is going to be an inner join. So if all of a sudden your user gets deleted, all of your scheduling information has to get deleted with it as well. So what happens if like, okay, you quit, but you still have to run your final payroll, right? Well, you don't want to delete the user because you still want their scheduling information or like whatever hours they work, but at the same time, you don't want them to be able to sign in anymore. So like you want to keep their data in the database, but you don't want to, let them to continue to sign in. And so that's when you use something like that deleted flag or disabled, right? Where you could set disabled to true. The authentication system could go, oh, you're not allowed to sign in anymore, but I still have access to all of your scheduling information or whatever other data was stored in the database. Because if you do actually delete the user, it would cause issues with your join tables, essentially.
Okay. And so, but in that scenario too, like they wouldn't, if let's say I went back to the first restaurant, they wouldn't reactivate me as SBater. They would start me over as SBater 4 because it's a new instance of the information, or does it just depend on what
depends on how it's built out. Technically, there's no reason why they couldn't reactivate you. But there is a reason why they make usernames unique, obviously. So like it would be harder for you to get your old username back as a new instance than it would be to just re-enable you or create a new user for you, right? Like it depends if you, and this is a requirement that you would have to ask like the client you were building it for. If you said, oh, I want the ability to re-enable users, then you would have to give them some ability to see the deactivated users to be able to get in and re-enable it. They may also say, oh, it's just easier for us to create something as new, so your old schedule information doesn't like carry over and screw up any of the new stuff. In which case they would say, oh, we have to give you a new username because usernames have to be unique.
Okay. Thanks. I always wondered that because I was always a new, every place I had a new number. But it makes sense too. And also you want to be tied, like my info with each place is unique to that place. So I should have a unique username tied to each new restaurant.
Yes. Yeah. And I'm sure that is something where like, they did not have the uniqueness set up. And then the first employee that, worked at the second restaurant signed in and was like, oh, I can get all this other information in here. And they had to go back to what we were talking about, major, minor patch. They had to get a patch out really quickly to be like, oh, we've got to search across our whole database to make sure the username is unique. And so there are all kinds of constraints that can come up around that. But, we talked about like the column name and the data type. There are a shitload of other fields that you can add into Postgres to be like, oh, by the way, every row in this needs to be unique. So if you create another username that is identical, don't allow that row to be inserted. So there are ways of running in your SQL, setting up the table. There are something called indexes that you can set up to basically tell the database, hey, I use a where query on this column a lot. So you should index everything in this column. So when you're searching for the one row that I'm looking for, you can pull out that data faster. So we barely covered like basic SQL. There is, like I said, I took 2 semesters on the database, like 2 separate courses on it. There is a whole world of databases that you can dive into. But we just try to cover the basics. But good question.
Thanks.
Anyone else have questions before I crawl to my whiskey? I mean,
Can we still bug you, or can I still bug you with questions about SQL?
sure thing.
Okay, I would really love to be done like now, but I think I'm gonna have questions. Okay.
And Kyle, I have not forgotten about your questions. I would just schedule some time with me, and I will work through them, and then I can always share that recording, just cut out, whatever I think is helpful for the class and share it with them. Awesome. Well, you guys have an awesome evening, and I will hopefully see you tomorrow at 7:30.
And I'm gonna get those timestamps where you saw in chat. It's just you're trying to follow a lot of things. So, okay. Thank you.
Sounds good. See you guys.
Yeah, I forgot we were live. I was like,
All good.
Thank you.
I can cut out the audio at that point.
yeah, or parts of it, or that's what I meant.
No problem.
Mentioning, who it was, and I just like, duh. Okay.
All right. I'll see you guys.